There we go. We did it. Success. Welcome, everyone.
Cool.
Welcome all 4 of you, or 0.
4
3,
people.
4.
Yep.
4. And growing. Cool. So, this stream is going to be focused on critiques, but I don't know. I figured while I talk about stuff at the beginning, I would throw one of my CAD drawings up here. So it's from last term, and not much more to say about that. It was a demo. It took about an hour, maybe hour-long demo, full value. And I don't know, last week's live stream, or maybe 2 weeks ago. But today we're going to be focused on critiques, right? So we're going to be focused on figuring out how we handle student critiques. So basically, if you take one of my classes and you sign up as like a gold level student, you'll have an opportunity to watch the demo, get the reference photos, and then draw your own drawings from those reference photos, and you can upload them to our website. And then the following week, ideally, if I'm not falling behind, you would receive a critique video in return that has your critique and all the critiques for the rest of the students in that class. You can see them all. And essentially, I just go through them one by one and do this, right? We print them out. Like I print out each critique. Oh, dang, I broke it. Okay. My tape wasn't strong enough. It fell off. Thank you. Okay, so we do this, right? We basically get this, and I would print out the student's drawing, and then basically tape it here, and then tape a piece of tracing paper over top of it, and draw right on top, and kind of draw my version of what they drew, and we kind of work from the same piece of reference, so we have like a common goal. And then at the same time, it's not, I don't know, a lot of people are like, oh, you're just tracing, but it's not. I mean, I'm basically just drawing my head, but I can size it as like a one-to-one type thing to the student drawing, and it kind of gives them an opportunity to see what I would do differently and what I'm changing and why and that kind of stuff. Also, I forgot to get the reference on my computer.
Do you want me to click on it?
No, I just got to find it. I think I got to sign back in though.
Computer.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
that was the whole reason I was putting them in Drive. Anyway, sorry, I got to type in a password real quick. But that's what we're going to be doing today, just so you guys can see a little bit of that process. We had, I think, like 4 people send stuff in, 5 people. And essentially, you can see I've just got them taped up, right? And each one has a piece of tracing paper on top of it, and we'll just kind of work our way through them. And I tend to spend a lot of time on them, probably more than I should. I don't know. I like to do thorough critiques, I guess. Okay, let me see if I can find this. Go here. And here. Sorry, my laptop's also broken, which doesn't help. It's really hard to select things. There we go. And download. Okay. So that's kind of the plan. And yeah, while I wait for that to download, if anybody's interested, you can see some of the drawings from last term. I guess that was the last live stream. I think that was. Yeah, I think that was the last one. And before that was like a critique live stream. And I think before that was the karate live stream. Sorry, I'll not get this in the way. This was the week 5 facial feature demo, right? Where we spent all term studying facial features, and then on the final week kind of brought it all together into a head, complete head with all the facial features. And I had a lot of 20-minute class, like a 20-minute figure class last term, so there's a lot of like kind of 20-minute quicker type drawings on here. I think that was a live stream as well. We had like a portrait live stream recently where I drew that. That was a week 5 demo. So if you take like a regular head drawing class with me or figure drawing class, I'll usually start out more like focus on construction and structure and anatomy. and then we'll quickly kind of work our way up to full value in rendering. And that was for the recent head class. That was like the week 5 demo. You know, usually the last 3 weeks of the head drawing or figure drawing class, I'll go full value. See if my stuff's ready here. There we go. My download is complete. Open. And now I have reference I can see. Sorry, I know you guys can't see over here, but I've got an old broken down laptop. Anyway, you can see this kind of stuff, right? For the facial feature class, where we'll go over like the anatomy of the ear, what it looks like from a few different angles, and then figure out like, oh, okay, what, you know, if we're drawing like a specific person's ear, what does that look like? What does it look like if you kind of like render out an ear? Yeah, I don't know. That's the idea. These are all the demos, and then the other aspect is all the critique videos, right? Because every term, then we also do a whole bunch of critique videos for all the gold level students. And then what's cool is if you sign up at the lower level, like at the silver level, then you can also watch the critique videos. You're just not in them necessarily, but you can watch all the other students' critiques for that class. So let's take a look here. And this one is up first. This one got turned in first. There's the reference. So this is something I've never drawn before. I've never seen this guy or this piece of reference until today, which is a little challenging. Anytime you draw someone for the first time, to be honest, it's kind of hard. It's hard to get a likeness like perfectly on the first try. Like the more times you draw someone, the easier it gets. But there's some things that stand out to me here when I look at this, right? The first is that the face feels a little bit taller, and the whole head shape really, because you can see, right, his construction lines. And oh, also the other thing, I forget who turned this in. I forget their name. But regardless, if you're watching this, my printer prints things a little bit too light, sometimes a lot too light, but I have your drawing here on the computer as well. At least I should. Well, maybe not, but your value was actually pretty good that you put in here and filled everything in with, but my printer tends to print a little bit too light. So usually I'll always have the student drawing up next to the reference so I can kind of see the values more correctly, like according to the photo that they sent in. But as I was saying, the whole head shape feels a little bit taller than his head type. And I think the end result is it's making the hat feel a little bit large and big as well up here. You know, because you're fitting the hat on top of his head, but the head has a little bit too much like cranium right up in here, you know, and it's tough to see here, but on the computer I can see that construction line that you kind of use for the big shape of the head. And it's nice, you drew a pretty good head shape, really. You know, now it's just going to be a matter of sizing it to fit his head type exactly, and then also making sure that the features are placed on there in a way that gets them to fit. And right now, you have so much cranial mass up here, it feels like the features are kind of squished a little far down on the head. But then at the same time, compared to the reference, it's like a little bit too tall. So we got to figure out exactly what's going on and why. And then this eye just feels really big to me, especially compared to this one. I mean, if we look at the size of the iris right here and compare it over here to this one, like it's bigger, not by a lot, but it's bigger. And this eye is actually farther away from us, right? Because his head's turned this way a little bit. So what we need to do is kind of convey the idea that this eye is actually a little bit farther away than this eye. And so we need to make this one a tiny bit smaller than this one, right? This one should be like the slightly bigger eye and this one the slightly smaller eye. And instead they kind of feel reversed a little bit, right? They feel like this is kind of the small one and this is the big one. And so it's kind of taking the far side of his head and like pulling it back around towards us a little bit. And so we'll have to avoid that as well. And then there's just too much information in there, right? So when we have somebody in shadow like this, we can't put too much information in the shadows. And I know you're probably still working on the construction, and what's difficult is to get that effect of not having much information in the shadows, you can't really have a bunch of construction lines in there either, you know, which is why you want to get so familiar with the construction that when you fill all this in and you lose those construction lines in there, that it doesn't really matter that much. You know where they are, you know where things go, and you can just kind of like recreate it as needed. And then we'll put like a really subtle eye indication on this side. but very subtle, and it won't be linear. I would just do like a little tonal indication. And I don't know. But to be honest, it seems like you just haven't gotten that far. I mean, maybe that's what you're planning on doing. So this is kind of the process we would use, right? Is this kind of tracing paper, and then we need the head shape. So his head shape is a little bit smaller. So I kind of have to decide, how do I want to change it, right? Because then as an instructor, like there's different ways we can change and fix things, but I'm going to try to follow essentially the same process you did, which, you know, if you take our classes is probably going to be something, or, you know, watch my demos or whatever, or just read the Loomis book. You'll figure out that you kind of work from big shapes to small shapes. You know, so I'm going to try and stick with the same kind of big shape of the head as much as I can and start with the same size cranial mass so that you can kind of see how I'm building off of it. Because that initial shape that we put down is really critical. Like it really sets the bar for the rest of the drawing. You know, looking forward, again, just the big shape of the head. And not to sound weird, but the big shape of the head is probably the hardest part of the whole drawing. I mean, I know the other parts are hard. Features are hard, rendering's hard. But all of it kind of depends on getting this big shape correct. And if you don't, then everything you build on top of it doesn't work quite right. You know, so you have to just practice these shapes over and over. So rhythmically, I want a nice rhythm that goes from the back of the head and sweeps down through the jaw. And what I'm noticing, again, is I think the head shape that you made is a little bit too tall, right? So we're gonna have to bring that jaw up just a little bit. And probably it's gonna swoop right in through here. Keeping my lines nice and light right now because they need to be very changeable. And then his chin is basically sitting right about here. He's got a little bit of a tilt going on, so we want to kind of tilt that line a little bit. And this right here is kind of one of the main changes. You know, there's just kind of a difference in that jaw shape. And then also shrinking the head this way, just a little bit, not a ton, but enough that it's making a difference. Now, I think he has, he's definitely got a little bit of a tilt going on, right? Like everything's not level, it's all tilted. So you got that working pretty well. We just need to figure out where the center line sits. And I think part of what's going on here and part of why this eye is so big is because the center line actually needs to shift over a little bit more, right? So if we move this center line over, it's going to shrink the space you have for the eye, make the space for this eye a little bit bigger, and I think that'll match his head a little bit more and kind of what we're seeing. So I'm just going to throw center line on here, see if we can get that tilt. Yeah, I think it's going to sit kind of like that. Might be tilted a little bit too much. No. I think it might be okay. I'm trying to make it tilt just a little bit less. I mean, as you can see, like it's not like everything goes perfectly on the first try. There we go. Now, here's what's tough, right, is we can't see his hairline because the hat's blocking it. So we basically just have to guess. Typically, on most people, that hairline is going to sit up above the change in plane of the forehead, right? So that change in plane of the forehead is about here, right? Because here we're going this direction, right? Here we're kind of going this direction. So that change in plane is occurring here. The top of that is roughly about here. So that could be the hairline. Or it could sit a little lower, right? Because then it just depends on the person. It's a little bit different on everybody. This is just like a general rule. But it's going to sit probably around here. He seems like the kind of guy that might have like a smaller forehead maybe. We can shrink it down a little bit, but we don't want to go too far, right? Because we don't want to have too much cranial mass up here. You know, again, he doesn't seem like the kind of guy that has like a really big cranial shape up there. So that's kind of our adjusted proportions, and then we'll go in here and break the head down into thirds. And we can even measure on him real quick. I can lean over here and just kind of measure. And what I've noticed over the years, I think this isn't one of our photos. This photo, I think, is like an Earth's World photo, which I think is a guy named Earth that's a photographer, and he takes cool photos. I think at like state fairs and stuff. They're a really cool reference. They always have good lighting. And yeah, so whoever turned this one in, which I forget who it was exactly, but it's a good choice. It's a really cool photo. Oh, so that's right. I forgot. I was measuring. What I was going to say about the Earth's World photos is what I've noticed is that he photographs really interesting looking people. And one of the main themes I've seen amongst his photos is they tend to be people that have small middle thirds, right? So usually what we would do is break the head into thirds, right? Kind of something like that. Although there's not that much of a tilt. I pushed that too far. Right, it might look something like that. Measure these, make sure they're reasonably close. Seems about right. Yeah.
There's a question about the hairline. Actually,
Yeah.
there's two questions.
Okay, two questions.
So the first question is from Isaiah,
Yeah.
who asks, do you have a rule or principle for designing your shadows? And then I'll just read you the second one real quick too, which is from Kate. And she asks, would this also apply if the person doesn't have a hairline, like if they're bald?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, if they don't have a hairline, it works the same way because, like, for construction purposes, we need to figure out how to break the face into thirds, right? If that top line is the hairline, then this is kind of how I would find it if somebody didn't have hair. It would be literally this logical. I would say, like, well, here's the front plane, here's the back plane, here's kind of that change in plane, right? Kind of sitting there. And I know and again, it's a very general rule, but on most people, it's going to sit near the top of that change in plane that exists between the top and bottom, or the like front and top planes, I guess. Yeah, confusing myself. Right. And so if he had no hair, I would kind of basically just look for this point and then build those thirds off of that. So yeah, that's a pretty good question. Can't remember what the first question was. Oh, it was about shadows?
Yeah, do you have a principle for designing your shadows?
Principle for designing shadows. Yes.
Or shadow pattern?
Yes, shadow pattern. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of rules that govern that. And it's the type of thing where you got to like learn the rules and stick with them until they start to become like intuitive, and then you can just work more freely and design stuff in a more interesting way. And so yes, there's definitely a thought process behind it, but to be honest, it would take a very long time to explain because there's a lot to it. But it comes down to basically just like finding edges, essentially. Shape, value, and edge, right? Those are the three main things. So you're designing shape, and the actual shadow, the shape itself to describe the forms properly, and then you'll have the edges of those shapes, and you have to adjust those edges to fit the forms properly, and then you'll have the actual value of the shape itself.
I wanted to mention also, this is from Jesse, this drawing.
Oh, good. Jesse, this is your drawing. I couldn't remember. I forgot. I printed it out earlier. So you can see I'm keeping the brow line. It's roughly ending up at about the same spot, but we're shrinking the thirds a bit. So I probably brought the hairline down a little, brought the chin up a little bit. And again, shifting that center line. And you can see kind of what I was talking about, right? How right now you have so much space right here. It feels really big, but by shifting that center line over, we shrank that a lot, and it just takes a lot of practice to get to the point where, you can kind of see that those proportions just right. Like, because then the question usually is, well, how do you know where to put the center line? And the truth is, there's a little bit of guesswork involved, But that guesswork is informed by years of practicing drawing boxes and cylinders and perspective and then just drawing a lot of heads and getting a feel for like when something looks right and when it doesn't. And keep in mind that shifting that center line is typically one of the main ways I fix a lot of stuff. And yeah, it's an easy tool. Anytime you have a big eye like that over there, it's almost always a center line issue. I'm confused here. Let's see. He's got a very like narrow eye socket. This guy has an interesting head. It's kind of sitting in here, right? A little bit like that. Over here we have the brow bone sticking out a bit, and then it kind of cuts back in. Right, cheekbone kind of sticks out from there. Kind of going out that way, and then dropping back this direction. Now, here's what's tricky, right? The fact that we moved the center line means we've got to move everything, right? So I'm basically just drawing a different head at this point, but it's going to be important to see. So here's one of the other things that stood out. Right, when I looked at your drawing and then I looked at the reference, one of the very first things I noticed was this distance right here between the bottom of that eye socket or eyelid or however you want to think of it, and then the top of this little shape behind the nostril. This feels really long, right? Like if you look at the reference, it should be on the screen. If you look at the reference and just kind of look at these 2 points on the reference and then look at your drawing and look at these 2 points, and you'll see that like it feels way longer here than it does in the reference, right? And that's also one of the things that told me that the face was too tall, you know, and probably the whole head was too tall. On top of that, what also is causing that is the nostril, I think, is really small. And so I think we need a bigger nostril, and I think it needs to sit a little bit higher. And as we do that, it'll shift this shape up a little bit. As we shrink the head a little bit, it'll bring both parts together, and then it'll start kind of getting in the range of where we need it. You know, so when I go to draw that nose, that's one of the things I want to keep in mind. And we can see he's got glabella kind of dropping down this way, nose comes out this way. Again, just kind of judging that angle as best I can, and then finding this part of the nose. He's got a pretty big nose. Right, kind of drops down that direction. And then the nostril, notice, sits a lot higher than the septum down here. Although this is really the bottom of the alar cartilage, but it leads up into the septum. And so really the shape that we have is kind of going up this direction to go over to where the nostril is. And then that nostril is sitting like way back here. Kind of like somewhere around in there. I think it goes up a little bit more. You know, so that's kind of what I would start with. And notice now what we're ending up here with is a much smaller space right here. You know, so those, again, that center line and like the size of this far eye versus, you know, the space here. If it starts looking too big, move that center line. And then one of the other things I commonly check is that distance, you know, between here and here. I think that would be helpful. And then from there, we could just kind of complete the shape of the head, right? It just kind of drops down. Keep it nice and subtle and careful, which you did. This is pretty subtle. This looks pretty good. You know, this comes down and connects to his chin, which kind of wraps back under here a little bit. We're seeing like, actually, I don't know, I take it back. I was gonna say we're seeing like a little bit of the underplane of his jaw, but I don't know. It's incredibly subtle if we actually are. I think maybe a little bit, but also we need, of course, the ear. In your case, I think the ear is a little bit small, just a little bit. It's going to sit back here. A little bit of an angle. All right, now we got to figure out exactly where it's going to sit. It's going to be partly I'm just saying like, okay, the bottom of the ear sits just below the nose line here. Top of the ear, or connection point of the ear is kind of even with the brow. So we can just kind of drop it right in here. It's pretty big. He's got a big ear. Notice tilting it, letting it overlap this line a little bit, and then pulling this part back off. It's not something I saw anywhere, but it works pretty well for me. You know, break this bottom third into thirds.
Another couple of questions here.
Okay.
One's a follow-up sort of comment on the question about the hairline.
Yeah.
From Kate.
Yeah.
So she says that your answer was super helpful and that she struggles with knowing what to do in that case, so if they're bald.
Yeah.
But she says she also struggles with finding the chin on bearded people and the jawline for bearded people.
What I would recommend for bearded people is if you need to find, you know, it's certainly helpful if you start with that big shape first and add the beard onto it. But yeah, it's hard because you can't see the jaw and the chin. But I would do essentially what I did here, but the opposite, right? So if you can see a person and you're able to find that hairline and you're able to maybe see, and it's tough, like I wouldn't do this on my drawing so much as like the model or the photo or whatever. I would just look at them and say, okay, their middle third is here. So if we duplicate that, that should take us down to the chin, right? And then it's just a matter of figuring out what type of person you're drawing, right? Because a lot of people have really big jaws, so it's pretty common to have someone with a kind of a large bottom third, you know? I mean, I don't know, common enough that I have to draw it frequently. My head works that way too, so maybe that's why I'm always focused on it. But every now and then there's somebody with a large bottom third of their head. So you just have to decide what type of person they are at that point. And honestly, it doesn't really matter because it's all covered in beard anyway, right? So what you're really doing is creating a space where you're able to break down those thirds to figure out exactly where the mouth goes. And so what I would recommend is start with an even third, right? Just kind of duplicate this third down to here. And then from there, go in and, you know, create your mouth and stuff. And if you look at it and you're like, wow, this mouth feels way too close to the nose compared to the model or the photo, then they probably have a bigger jaw and their chin probably sits a little bit lower, right? Like there's a lot of people where the bottom third is like maybe a half a chin to a chin length longer than the top two. You know, so I would just then pull the chin down a little bit and adjust those thirds, and that'll cause the mouth to move down a little bit. And hopefully that'll help you get the mouth placed. Yeah, anyway, that's what I would do. It's like reverse engineering things a little bit. And a little bit of a neck shape here real quick. Not sure why, but felt like doing it real fast. Anyway, okay, back to work. Let's see. Side plane of his head sits around here, kind of. Not that we really need it right this second. If we want to get into construction and rhythm lines and construction lines, this is kind of where they would go.
There's another question,
Okay.
if I could interject really
Yeah,
quick.
yeah.
So this is from Brickman,
Okay.
and Brickman's back.
Brickman, welcome back.
He says, hi guys. Brian, could you explain the region of the glabella on the Asaro head? It is somewhat confusing. What I've managed to deduce is that it is a sum of the glabella with the superciliary arch. I think that's what that says. Yeah.
I think you're right. I'm not sure about the arch part exactly. I don't remember the exact terminology, but I know what you mean. I have an Asaro head here somewhere. I'm going to try and grab it real quick. Hopefully this doesn't look too awkward. Can you click that thing back to OBS so I can see what I look like on there and what I'm actually filming?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna grab this thing so people can see what you're talking about. Ah, there we go. This is the Asaro head. It is A little bit heavy, but not too bad. This is kind of what you're talking about, is this big flat spot right here. And man, it makes this thing so hard to draw. It is ridiculous. And then just the general shape of the head for some reason on this is really difficult to capture. There's certain things over the years that I have learned from the Asaro head and have been incredibly helpful, and other things that over the years I've just ignored completely. This being one of them. Right, the things that I usually focus on here is this brow, like the outer part of the brow, the shape of the eye, the planes of the eye. The cheekbone is super, super helpful, and kind of how it connects into this space a little bit. You know, the difference between how you have like the complex side versus the simple side is good to know. But, oh, and then these little planes on the nose down in here can be kind of helpful. I've studied those a bit. But I've kind of ignored the rest of the nose because it feels like a really kind of small nose that's kind of pushed far down on the head, right? So I think with the way the Asaro head works, I'm gonna see if I can do this on the camera and get it to line up. Like if you wanted to break this down the way that I teach head breakdowns, which is kind of a mix of Loomis and Riley, I think when we do the thirds, it would actually go like here, like right through the middle of this flat spot, right? And then we would have, of course, the bottom connection point of the nose, the chin, and then the hairline doesn't sit right here, but sits like farther up here a little bit. I don't think I can draw on this thing, but it would be like up here a little bit higher, right? And if we do that right, I think this all kind of lines up. Let's see, we'd have this part, maybe this part down here. Definitely these bottom two kind of match like that. But then it has like a really small forehead, basically. But I think you're right, because for some reason this shape here, that keystone shape, is kind of what I usually teach as being the glabella. And I know the glabella, technically, if you look it up, I think is a larger shape that extends a little bit farther up. That's kind of what I usually call the glabella. But for some reason, it's really low, because normally I would line the top of the glabella right here up with that third line. And the fact that it's being pushed down so far seems a little bit odd, and it's shrinking the nose to be really tiny. And so I guess my point is I just ignore that stuff. The stuff that is a little bit strange about it and doesn't match all the other stuff that I learn, I just ignore it and change it, really. I mean, gosh, there's too much stuff on this pad, but I've done, occasionally I do Asaro head demos. Oh my gosh, I flipped right to it, and it seems like this time I was drawing it the way it actually is. Sorry, I don't mean to be blocking my face, but like I ran that third line right through this big flat spot, right? Same thing on this one. I'm running that third line right through the big flat spot, and then I'm enlarging the cranial mass to make it all work, right? And then sometimes, depending, I don't know why I do it sometimes that way and sometimes this way, but depending on, I don't know, I have to go back too far to find another one. But sometimes I'll just change the glabella so the glabella sits higher up, and then you'll essentially make the nose longer, right? And just extend the nose upward until it matches, and then you can just treat it like the regular head drawings. Anyway, where was I with this guy? This is the major changes I would make to this guy, right? And then we can start getting this hat on here, which is tough. Hats are always a challenge, right? It's gonna sit probably up to about his hairline. It's wrapping back behind his ear here. Kind of doing this. Right, kind of coming around that way. Notice I haven't put the bill of the hat on. I'm just kind of leaving that for last, because we want to make sure the hat actually fits on the head, which I don't think you had a problem with. If anything, it comes out too far, actually, right? Like it sits like right on his head, right? So the rest of it's going to be pretty close to his forehead here. Kind of come out this way. Back part's going to come from behind his ear, which I moved his ear a little bit, but It's going to come from like back here, kind of shoot up this direction a little bit. And then I'm just going to kind of simplify it real fast here. Kind of shoots up this way, back across this way, and then sort of wraps down that direction. And what's interesting is my hat actually ended up close to the same size as yours. And I was thinking yours was really big, but I don't know, maybe I made mine too big too. Maybe he has his hat pulled down farther than I think. But regardless, I think this will kind of work. And then here's the hard part, is adding the bill. It's always difficult, right? So we're just going to kind of judge where it starts, see if we can construct it in a logical way here, right? Remember, we're drawing something wrapping around this guy's head. So this is actually wrapping around the other side and connecting all the way back around his head, if we could see through to the other side. So that is kind of wrapping around. It's going to start right about there. So we just have to judge the angle properly on each one. That wasn't quite right. Yours is actually pretty good. I'm changing it a little bit, but you drew a pretty good hat, especially considering how difficult it is to draw hats. Come out that way. And they're going to link together. Now, something like this, taking perspective can really help with it, right? Because we really have to treat this like a three-dimensional form that's wrapping around the head. You know, if you understand perspective and how perspective works, it becomes a lot easier.
There are some questions for you.
Okay.
First of all, my mom and grandma are watching. So
Oh,
hello to them.
hello, Olivia's mom and grandma.
Also,
Yeah.
Luis is here. He
Luis,
says,
welcome.
hello. He says, nice to see you, Brian, and hope you're feeling better today.
I am.
And then, let's see, Brickman says, thank you for your answer about
Cool.
the Asaro head.
Yeah.
And then some wise guy, which is his name,
Okay, some wise guy.
some wise guy says, have you drawn the Chinese Drawing Academy planes of the head?
I have not drawn the Chinese Academy planes of the head. I think I know what you're talking about. I think I've seen that book before. And they seem very Asaro-like, but kind of different. I'm actually going to look it up right now and see if it's what I think it is. Academy planes. Let's see if this works. I don't know if Google is smart enough to figure this out. All I'm seeing is a whole bunch of Asaro head photos. But I've seen a book. I think I know what you're talking about. When I was at Watts, there was a book that circulated for a little while that was like a Chinese Academy art school type book. And I would like to study it. It seemed really cool. It seemed like an awesome book. And it had a lot of good stuff in there, for sure. Kind of wish I had it. I'm curious where to get it.
The next question is actually a comment.
Okay.
It's from Dr. Nader, and he says, there's no rules, just tools, from Vilpoo.
No rules, just tools. Yeah, Vilpoo's cool. That sounds like a good rule. The rule is that there are no rules. So there's kind of like one rule, I guess. It's like one rule that negates itself. Anyway, getting some sideburns on there. Not sure where I'm going with this exactly. So I don't know how far I want to take these 642. I've been working on this thing a long time, and I wanted to get through a number of these, but I wanted to talk a little bit about like shadow mapping and stuff. So I think I'm going to stop and not draw like all the features in necessarily, and we'll just see if we can add some shadows on here real quick. But you can see, right, we shrank this space considerably, right? So now that eye is going to be way smaller in here. And this one has a little bit more space this way. He has a pretty wide nose, so like to find the tear duct, side plane of his nose is more like here maybe. Right, his eyes sit really high up in the sockets. They're like disappearing up into them kind of. So we need like an eye line here. That's pretty high. Nostril shape maybe. Although I just got done saying I'm not going to draw all the features. Apparently I am. The nose kind of wraps around there a little bit. It's in shadow, so it doesn't look that obvious, but it's kind of what it's doing. I think this nostril could still be even a little bit larger. Kind of doing this. It's kind of sitting like that. Right, he's got this big mustache. There's a reason I didn't draw the mouth, and it's because we can't see much of it. It's covered in mustache, right? So we need to get like a really cool looking mustache shape out here. You know, it's kind of like shooting out this direction. This way a little bit. Right, kind of drops down this direction. Let's see, this way. Using plumb lines, right? How do we know where this goes? Well, I'm pretty confident with my eye socket shape, so I can just say what's directly above the corner of the mustache. It'd be like the back part of the eye right about there, so that works out about right. You know, remember there's a tooth cylinder shape in here, you know, and then a chin shape, kind of protruding outward a little bit. And so his mustache now is going to wrap around this way. And kind of back around this way. We get the same thing out here where we get a little bit of like an overlap, right? So here it's kind of shooting out. Kind of this direction. Right? Again, thinking of those three-dimensional forms, right? Like I'm curving everything in a way that kind of matches that big mustache shape that he's got going on, right? And then it's wrapping around the outside here. And these overlaps are going to be really important, right? So we have this part overlapping this part overlapping here. You know, and to help show that depth, bottom lip is kind of dropping down this way, very thin. It's kind of sitting right down there. Chin sitting down here. That's enough. So, I mean, somebody was asking about shadow shapes, and that's kind of what I wanted to actually do on here. I just got caught up in the talking about the construction. That's looking a little bit more like him. Honestly, I think I still have the head a little bit tall. I think I could have brought that chin up just a little bit more, but it's better. Let's find, well, let's just go for it, I guess. Right, so we'll kind of start with that. Now, shadow shapes, again, as you were asking, yeah, they have a lot of rules that kind of govern them. And then once you know them really well, then you can kind of apply that stuff without thinking about it, and you can think more about design. You know, so for starters, what we have is a cast shadow from the hat down onto the head, right? And it's creating a pretty hard edge, really. Yeah, so we can just start with a really hard edge coming down from the hat. Then it kind of cuts up and over the brow. You know, I think I made the brim of the hat maybe a little bit wide, or a little bit, yeah, wide this way. I think I should have brought it in a little bit. I think it works, right? So it's going to start there, and then we hit essentially the bottom of the brow bone. Like there's a little area of brow bone here picking up light. And so it's going to have a little bit of a soft edge right in there, because again, it's a rounded form. And it's just a little bit of light that we're then picking up a little bit more shadow back in the eye socket back here. You know, and again, so I'm kind of transitioning from harder edge for cast shadow to softer edge because we're hitting form shadows and they're describing rounded forms. You know, so like, I don't want to go into the whole thing, but essentially what it's governed by is the form that you're trying to put the shadow on. If it's a more rounded shape, then it's going to have a much more like soft edge. And if it's more of a angular type shape, then it's going to have a harder edge. Or the bottom of a shape, right? This is a good example too, right? Like this is a form shadow, but I'm still putting a hard edge there because that's right where the form ends, essentially. It's just like kind of ending. There's probably even a little bit of a cast shadow right there as well, now that I'm kind of looking at it. And then we hit the bottom of the eyelid, which is kind of wrapping this direction a bit, right? And then we see the shadow on the lid below, which is going to be really soft, right? Because now we're dealing with a really round form in here. And we're trying to describe that. So it's going to be like a softer type of edge. You know, he's got a little bit of wrinkliness going on out here. You can try and capture those as well, but if we want to be really technically correct, those are also shapes. And they need to be designed out as complete shapes and thought of as shapes. Right now they're a little bit wide probably, but even though they're thin little wrinkles, technically there's going to be like a little tiny soft edge and a little tiny hard edge. It's all going to lock together. Right, get kind of a harder edge for the end of that form right there. And now we're kind of transitioning into cast shadow again, right? So I know cast shadows are tricky. Like as a general rule, do they tend to have harder edges? Yeah, but then the farther that they're cast from the thing that's casting them, the softer the edge gets. You know, so like we kind of have to ask ourselves, like that edge along the nose right in here looks really hard, but it's also pretty far away from the hat. So this might be a good opportunity to just make like a real subtle change and just make it not quite as hard as it seems up in there. Maybe just soften it a little bit as it gets farther away from the hat. You know, and then this of course links down into shadow on his nose, and we're dealing with the alar cartilage here, which is very round. It depends on the person, but in this case it's very round. So we're going to have some very soft edges here. You know, and then we're picking up a little bit of shadow. No, not really. It's just kind of like where this form ends. Maybe a little bit of shadow right in here. And then we get a cast shadow from the nose, which kind of drops down this direction. And it's kind of merging with the mustache, right? Which, even though it's a cast shadow, if you have a cast shadow cast onto hair, it's going to disrupt that edge. It's going to make it really soft. You know, then we'll pick kind of a soft edge down around there. Down around in here as well. Right, we have a little bit of light on the lip right here. I don't know enough to worry about too much. But we do have a little bit of light kind of right up in here, right? So we pick up that kind of like lower lip, mentolabial, what is it? The mentolabial sulcus, I guess, which is technically that point right there where the lip connects back to the chin. And then we have like a little cast shadow from the mustache down onto here. Again, it's a cast shadow, but it's coming from a mustache, so it's going to be very soft. You know, and notice, like, as I design this stuff, it actually is very logical. Like, I'm thinking my way through each thing. I'm thinking, like, okay, what kind of form is this? What type of edge do we need to describe it properly? And then draw it. All right, a little bit of a shadow across here, and then we hit the chin.
I think this might be a good time to ask you the next question.
Okay.
This is from Luis.
Yeah.
He says, "Hey Brian, I've always wondered how to manage doing those little random strokes when drawing hair or beards. Would you mind explaining about that?"
Oh yeah, you're talking about these little strokes right in here. Part of that is just a lot of practice, because it takes, you know, a certain amount of dexterity to be able to do it. But that's not to say that there isn't a little bit of a trick to it too. And that trick is to use the side of the pencil, but in a way where you're dragging it like this way. And I can create these like really thin little lines like that, right, by dragging it. And what's tricky though is I'm pretty sure, because when I look at your drawing, I know you're using different supplies, right? Like you're using like, I don't know, regular drawing paper maybe. I'm not sure what it is exactly, but it's much more rough, and it's going to take the charcoal a lot differently. And that's going to make it tough to create these little lines, right? So what I would recommend is go look at somebody like Nathan Fowkes. I don't know how to say his last name, but it looks like Fowkes. And then Steve Houston, both of those guys, because they work in a similar way where it's charcoal, but like on regular paper kind of, and they work in much softer forms and less detail. And that's kind of what you have to do with those supplies, because you can't get quite the same level of detail that you see me get in the demos, because I'm using, you know, like an actual charcoal pencil on smooth newsprint. And the benefit of that is that it lets me go more detailed. But then the downside is a lot of people can't get those supplies. And depending on where you are in the world, you might not be able to at all.
So he says yes, it is regular paper that
Yeah.
he uses.
And that's fine. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like there's anything wrong with that. There's not. I mean, if that's what you can get, then that's what you should use. There's tons of good artists out there that use that stuff, right? Like, it's not like it's impossible to draw cool stuff. It's just going to have different limitations to it. And it's going to have different advantages and different disadvantages and things like that. And one of those is going to be detail, right? Like, you're not going to be able to work so much with those fine little lines and like hatching and that kind of thing. And you'll have to work a little bit more generally. But I think if you go look at, like, again, Nathan Fowkes' charcoal drawings and Steve Houston's charcoal drawings, I mean, they're amazing. Like, they're awesome. If I was using those supplies, those are the guys I would be looking at for how to do that, you know? And just go look at how they draw hair and kind of the difference between how they draw hair and how I draw hair. And what you'll notice is they just focus much more on the big forms, right? Which is basically what I do at the beginning. I start with the big form, but then layer detail on top, and you won't be able to go quite as detailed. You know, you'll have to stick more with that big form, and then just adding a couple little key details here and there to make it read as hair, and then it should work fine. And hopefully it will look really cool.
There is one more question.
Okay.
And then, oh, and Luis says it's Pierre Noir B. Conte, I think.
Conte, yeah, that's a good pencil.
And
But
then
again,
paper.
with the regular paper, like, you can use the Conte, but you might need more than just that. Like, you might need maybe some generals that have like more of a range to them, like some harder pencils, some softer pencils. Because with the rougher paper, it's going to chew up that charcoal pencil really fast, and you're not going to get really smooth tone. And so it's going to use up your pencil really fast and then not quite give you the look you need. So there's times where you'll need to use that pencil, and then other times where maybe it doesn't, you know, quite do what you need it to do. I can let you know, because I know, I don't know, I've taken a number of classes where we use that stuff, and I don't remember exactly what the supplies were off the top of my head, but I can figure it out and let you know in Discord.
Okay, I have one more question for you.
Okay.
And I also want to keep us on track with time, so it's
Oh,
been
yeah.
about 55 minutes.
Oh, dang, it's a long
This
time.
could be a really long stream if we do.
Yeah, okay. I should probably do a different one.
Okay. But
Yeah.
the last question that I'm seeing here is from RF.
Yeah.
And they say, what is the Russian method of drawing?
I'll be honest, I don't know what the Russian method of drawing is exactly. I know they're very good at drawing, and I have some of their books. I have some cool, like, Russian books around here. But the problem is they're all in Russian, so I can't read any of them. I just look at the drawings and I'm like, dang, these are really cool. And I've done studies of them a few times. Trying to see if I can see them here. Oh, I see one. I see one of the books. I'm gonna try and grab it. Someone pointed out, I think it was in the last live stream maybe, they were kind of pointing out that the Russian method is more constructive and using basic shapes and moving them around, which is what I like. And that's probably why I like their drawings. But for some reason in the past, I've always heard that they work more like sight size type method. Sorry, I'm trying to see if I can reach the book, but I'm not sure I can. I think it's too far back there. Yeah, sorry, we'll have to look at it another time. But I like the Russian stuff. There's a lot of really good Russian artists and good Chinese artists, both. It would be really cool to learn more about how they work, definitely. Because from what I understand, I don't know why, but in the past I've always heard that they were like sight size type people. I don't think that's the case, because somebody pointed out, I think in the last stream, that that's not how they work. It's more constructive. And if that's true, then that's really cool, because that's kind of what their drawings look like to me. That probably would have been my guess if I hadn't had people tell me otherwise. And yeah. Just drawing an ear shape. I don't know. I shouldn't be getting caught up in this right now. We probably need to do something else. Okay, let's move on to the next one before I get too distracted. The next one happens to be Luis's. So you asked your question just in time. So we talked about the supplies, which is good, because that's one of the things I wanted to talk about with this drawing was I think you're going to have to use, like, you're picking up a lot of that texture. Some of that is fine, right? Like, using that strategically is good, but with the rougher paper, you might have to get like a blending stump and go in there and blend a little bit to get smoother tone, which is fine. Like the way I draw with the smooth newsprint and the charcoal pencil, I would typically tell people try not to blend things, and you want to get to the point where you can just do that with the pencil. But with the rougher paper, you're going to have to do it. There's no way around it. You can use your finger, but then the problem is you get the oils from your finger in there, and it can be a little weird if you're not careful. So you'd have to get one of those blending stumps and just kind of blend this stuff into smoother tone. And yeah, I think that'll work pretty well. Oh, we need to switch the reference photo.
I'll switch it right now.
Yeah. I loaded up all these reference photos earlier,
Okay.
and now nobody can see them.
Let's see here. So we got number 2. Boom. There she is.
There you go. Get that up on here. So aside from, you know, the tools and stuff, I think your construction is actually quite good. It even has her likeness a little bit. I mean, I'm not going to say it's perfect, but you know, I knew exactly which model it was when I saw it. Probably because, you know, it's from one of our photos. But it's pretty good. So let me see. Oh, I guess I didn't put your drawing on here. I remember your values being pretty good, right? So again, my printer tends to print things kind of light, but I remember your values being really good, except they were too dark in the eyebrows. And it was kind of like too dark in the eyes a little bit. It's okay to have some of that darkest dark in the eye, like in the pupil a little bit, maybe some of the cast shadow inside the eye. But you don't want that everywhere, right? Like I would reserve those darkest darks for like back in this area in the hair. And then in the face, just be really careful with them. The only place I would put that is like probably in the pupils. And yeah, and be careful with the eyebrows. I know she has like dark hair, but I don't know. You have to be really careful with how you create contrast. And we don't want the contrast to be up in the eyebrows. We want it to be down in the eye. And so I would push that darker value in the eye probably. And yeah, construction-wise, it's very close. I feel like this middle third right here might be a little bit long. Yeah, so I think this bottom third is a little bit small and it's causing the lips to sit a little bit high and feel a little bit small. You know, because your two middle thirds feel about right. Boom. And she fits those thirds like perfectly. You know, so I think the chin needs to be like down here, or we're gonna have to readjust. Like if I want to stick with the same head shape, we'll have to readjust how the features sit on there a little bit. The other thing I'm noticing is the eyes, the shapes of the eyes, I think could be a little bit better. And I think the space between the top of the eyelid and the eyebrow is too small. You know, so part of that, just changing the shape of the eye might help. And then I think the eyes need to sit a little bit lower in the sockets. You know, like this distance here feels a little bit long. It's close, but I think they could come down just a little bit. And yeah, I think it's looking pretty good. Overall, you did incredibly well. I mean, we'll just round this out a little bit. There's not really like that much to change. Start with, again, big shape of the head. You know, side plane of her head kind of drops down here. Back part. Swooping around that way. Now, she has a pretty round jaw shape over on this side. It's going to be kind of a tough jaw shape to capture. I'm going to start with the same head shape that you had. Right, so we're kind of building on the same thing here, which means we're going to have to move the features and kind of change where they're sitting, but I think for instructional purposes, that might be the best. I don't know, so her head's sitting in there somewhere. Right, center line seems placed pretty well. We can leave that in pretty much the same spot. She seems like she has a little bit of a tilt too, now that I'm looking at it. So we might need to get that in there. I don't really realize that until right now. In the photo, everything feels just a little bit more tilted. It's very subtle, so you could easily remove that tilt and I think the drawing would work just fine. I don't think it has to be in there. It might be good to put in there. Remember, hairline kind of goes up over the change in plane of the forehead, only in her case, I don't know, it seems about right. Seems like it sits about here maybe. Slight tilt to it, and then let's see if we can break this up into thirds, right? So part of what happened last time was that bottom third was too small. Let's see if we can find this one up a little bit, this one up a little bit. Measure. Sorry, I should probably zoom in a little as well. Here to here. Whoa, too big. Too big. Let's move this down just a little bit. You can see, I mean, it usually takes me a few tries to get this just right. That's pretty close. Pretty darn close. I think that's close enough that it'll work, but you can see, I mean, it's got to be almost right on. Right, then we need to think of it as like a three-dimensional form, right? So there's going to be like a corner kind of sitting out here that should kind of separate like our front and side plane, right? So the side plane of the head is over here, right? Kind of sitting out over here. We get the ear, back of the jaw, back in here. You know, that ear is going to sit a little low. Back around there. Again, kind of erase this part that overlaps the line. Sit back in there somewhere. We're looking up at her probably a little bit, so these lines are probably doing something like this if you want to get really into like the Loomis breakdown. Yeah, so that would be the big adjustment, I think, overall. Because, like, you drew nice features, right? You drew a nice nose, you drew pretty nice lips. Not quite hers, but very, very close, you know? The only thing that seems off to me is the shape of the eyes, so I'll see if we can get to that point. And then we'll probably move on to the next one, because apparently I spend too long on these. I have the same problem when I'm filming critiques for the classes. I spend too long on them. Happens all the time. Okay, her brow it's very flat at first, and then it's very round, right? So that rounded part, remember, we want to tie it together from side to side to create a nice rhythm between the two halves of the brow. You know, and yeah, we're not going to end up using this middle part, but we erase it back out, and what you end up with is a rhythmical relationship that exists between these two sides here. Right, this kind of drops down a little bit, cuts in, down this way a bit. I don't know, don't get too caught up in the bottom parts of these eye socket shapes because they don't end up in the drawing really. It's more just for construction purposes. And I know a lot of students are like, man, how are you making that shape exactly? And the truth is, it's not that important. I've been doing this a long time, so I can make them look kind of cool. But what's more important is the upper part of the brow shape is really critical. I mean, that has to be right. You know, where this little section is, you can see it on her pretty clearly where that shadow ends. Maybe just up a little bit from where the shadow is right there is kind of where the brow's wrapping back around and connecting back into the cheekbone. You know, that's kind of important because that'll help align the eyes, right? So that kind of tells us the eyes are going to sit probably right around here. That doesn't work on everybody, but probably along there. But this little bottom section, I don't know. To me, I just kind of draw something that fits the big shape of the head, knowing that, like, yeah, it's not really going to end up in the drawing, but you always want your drawing to look cool. Right? You should be able to stop at any point and have it look kind of complete within itself at any stage. Look over that shape of the nose. Right, we get a little bit of nostril out here on this far side sticking out, just a tiny bit. And then we got to figure out kind of where the nostril sits over here. And I'll be honest, I'm mostly just guessing right now. Right, slightly more, well, it's not that it's more narrow, but I think we should be seeing less of this nostril over there, right? So it kind of turns her nose a little bit more. Right, we can get a little bit more of this eye socket in here. Right, her cheekbone. Coming out this way, and then it kind of swings down this direction. Right, forehead kind of pops back out a little bit, and then up this way. You know, at this point we could put the hairline in if we wanted to make sure everything's working properly, or we could just kind of keep going. Either way is fine. Right, so we break this bottom third into thirds, which is going to look something like this. Maybe. Double check. It's pretty close. Right, remember her tooth cylinder pushes forward a little bit here. Right, and then the more the head turns, the more that happens. But then it depends on the person too, right? Some people have really prominent tooth cylinder shapes, other people not so much. You know, chin protrudes out a little bit. Then we can kind of design the features around that. So you can see we're kind of pushing that perspective a little bit more. And then adjusting those proportions for sure. Nose is going to kind of wrap back this way. Not that big of a nasal opening. I don't know that I would draw the other nostril in here necessarily. I don't think there's enough room for it. It's going to be such a small shape, I think it'll feel kind of awkward. I just leave that off for now. Let's see. I should get a mouth on here. Right, you drew a pretty good mouth. Feels like her mouth. It's pretty good. It's just like a little bit small. Could use maybe more of a defined shape out in here for that little node shape. You did pretty good. I mean, I think if you just keep studying mouths and mouth anatomy, practice drawing them from different angles, I don't think it'll be a big problem. Right, so that philtrum shape is going to sit right in there. And then it's going to kind of drop down this direction. Keeping my lines a little bit soft, right? You don't want too hard of an edge around the lips, even though it kind of looks that way. A lot of that's coming from the color change and the value change between the lip and the rest of the face. And the truth is that it's not actually changing like that. It's the changing color that makes it seem that way, when in reality it's a rounded form. You know, like there's not like an actual angle right there. It's a little bit of an illusion. Made her lip too wide. Really soft node shape out here. shrink this philtrum shape a little bit. I got a little bit wide.
When you're ready for more questions, there are a whole bunch.
Okay, a whole bunch of questions.
Mhm.
What do we got?
Okay, so I wanted to give you some time
Yeah,
to
that's
make
cool.
some progress.
Appreciate that.
So this one's from Celsius. Celsius says, "Hey guys, hope it's going good. Recently I've been doing shadow mapping and master studies in his sketchbook with a regular pencil. Is there any specific paper tools or tips I should know? Thank you."
Specific tools for sketchbook and pencil? What was it?
I think just generally. They're just saying that they've done shadow mapping and master studies in a sketchbook with regular pencil.
Yeah.
But what are the specific paper tools or tips that they should know?
Oh, I see. I would say, well, it depends on what your goals are a little bit, you know? Like, obviously, I'm a fan of training the way that I teach, right? But that's kind of the result of having gone to a very specific school and learning a very specific way of learning. And, you know, I don't want to make it sound like this is the only way, because that's not true. There's a lot of really good artists out there that learn all different sorts of ways. I mean, you know, there's some people that only ever work digitally and get crazy good. And then other people that are like, you have to learn traditional first, otherwise you'll never be good at digital. That's obviously not true. I mean, I think it helps for sure, but there's plenty of good digital people out there that aren't traditional people. So part of this, I mean, just keep in mind is can change depending on what your goals are. But like I use smooth newsprint, right? So like what we train with at Watts back when I was a student is they you know, make you buy smooth newsprint, and we use very specific charcoal pencils and sharpen them a very specific way. And it's a method of training that has specific advantages, right? Which is you get the best of charcoal, which is working really fast and creating soft edges really fast, plus the best of graphite, right? So we sharpen this thing in a way where we can flip it up on the tip and get all that crazy like thin line work and hatching and doing all of that kind of stuff. We can do both with one pencil, get the speed and the detail. And then you can also get a full range of value out of just this one pencil, right? Like I can do an entire full value drawing with one pencil and learn that and make that work just through pressure sensitivity, right? Which requires building a lot of dexterity. You know, I mean, you have to really, I don't know, have pretty good dexterity to pull it off. And so that eventually translates over into other things in theory if you want to go into inking and oil painting. And I mean, each of them requires slightly different dexterity, but you know, they're all hard in their own way, I guess. But learning this can help with that. But you don't have to. I mean, there's so many people out there that are crazy good that work, you know, only in graphite or only, so it's not like you have to do this. But essentially the newsprint I've been buying lately is Seth Cole, and it has to be smooth. It has to be smooth newsprint. If you get rough newsprint, it just doesn't work. It'll chew the pencil up and you can't get the same level of detail and it won't work well, you know? So if you can't get smooth newsprint, then you just have to figure out something else. But if you can, then it works pretty well. If you can get smooth newsprint, and then we used to always use the Conte pencils, right? Like the Conte 1710B or something like that. And I used those for years and years, and then eventually their quality control just got terrible, and they became basically unsharpenable. And so I stopped using them. And I wish they worked, but buying a box of 12 pencils so you end up with like maybe 4 usable ones isn't a practical way to train, you know? So I switched to this, which is a Wolf's Carbon 6B. And for training purposes, it works well. But then, you know, obviously the issue is, right, like it's not archival. You can't do finished work like this, really, like for a client or something. Like they're going to be like, what is this? You just gave me something on newsprint. That's no good. So it's just a training medium that lets you study shape, value, and edge and work quickly and efficiently and give you a broad range of stuff to do. That wasn't very specific, but yeah, I don't know. But there's nothing wrong. Like if you're like, yeah, look, all I have is, you know, an iPad or whatever. This is what I got to train with. That's fine. Like I have a lot of students that work digitally and turn in digital work, you know, and they just save it and give it to me. And then I treat it the same way. I print it out, slap some tracing paper on here, and I would do a critique for a digital student the exact same way I do here, because all those same principles apply. You know, it doesn't matter if you're working digitally or with graphite or with, I don't know, other types of charcoal, pastel, whatever it is. All the principles work the same way. You know, like all the shape, value, and edge stuff, it's all the same. So once you learn it with one medium, it's a lot easier to transfer to the other. I don't like this chin shape. You know, so once you learn how shape, value, and edge work, then when you go to paint, suddenly you don't have to think about that stuff quite as much, and you can focus just on color and temperature and saturation and that kind of thing, you know, which simplifies things a lot. You know, or if you're like, well, actually, I want to go into inking or graphite and work with that. You know, after doing this for a long time, yeah, it's going to take a little while. Like, how do you make a hard or a soft edge in ink, right? Like, it works differently. There's hatching involved. There's different ways of doing that. Maybe dry brush. I don't know. There's different ways. But at the end of the day, where you put that soft edge and how soft it needs to be works exactly the same way, regardless of the medium, whether you're using gouache, ink, I don't know, whatever. So yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, if you have like a specific thing that you're working with and you're like, well, I can't get smooth newsprint, but I can get this stuff, you know, you're welcome to message me on Instagram or Discord, and I can kind of tell you what I would do in that situation and what I would focus on. Kind of like I was telling Louise in the last one, like, you know, if you can't get smooth newsprint, that's fine, but just know that you're going to have to be really careful and probably blend a little bit more, and you probably won't get exactly the same level of detail, and things are going to work just a little bit differently, you know. And so all the construction stuff works the same, the shape, value, and edge stuff works the same. It's just figuring out how to make the marks and which type of marks you can make, and then what to do with them that changes.
Okay, got another question for you.
Yeah.
So this is from Kate.
Okay.
She says, I just realized my last drawing currently on my board is from the same reference photo, so of Sawyer, I think.
Oh, that's cool.
And she says that she's subscribed to the subscription library.
Nice,
So she's
yeah.
using our reference. That's
Very
awesome.
cool. Yeah. I took all these photos with like kind of students in mind, because there's a lot of places you can buy reference packs and things. Most of them have really advanced lighting, which is difficult lighting. And it's really good if you're a really advanced artist. I mean, you probably want the challenge and we'll make something cool out of it. But if you're trying to learn, it's a hard way to learn when you have really advanced lighting. So we just shoot all of our reference with like one single light source, and it creates really clear shadow patterns and stuff, and really it's good for learning.
There's a question relating to the reference from
Yeah.
some wise guy.
Yeah.
And they say, where can I get the reference photos? So maybe you could talk about
These reference photos go with our classes. So the only way to get them right now, like we don't sell our reference. We don't really sell reference packs or anything. So I just totally smudged my drawing with my knuckle. And, but if you take one of our classes, like the way it'll work is I'll film a demo with a specific piece of reference, and then I'll take photos of them. And what we'll give the students is like, you know, obviously the demo we recorded, you can watch that and stream it on our website. And then we give you photos of my demo, the photo reference that I use for the demo. And then depending on the class, like if it's just a regular head drawing class, I'll usually give you 3 more photos of different angles. So like, because it's always a lot easier to draw something after you watch a demo, you know, because then you just do what you saw in the demo. And yeah, it's hard, but it's not as hard as trying to do all your own problem solving, right? That's a little bit more challenging. And so I always throw in extra reference photos every week, you know? And so that's basically how you would get our photos, is you'd have to take the classes or sign up for the subscription library, because now we have a subscription library that has all of our old demo videos. And each time you pick a video, because the way it works is like you can subscribe to our library at different levels. Starts at like $10 a month, And then you can browse the whole library, but you get to watch, you basically get to pick 3 videos to watch each month at the $10 level. But then you get the reference along with them. And the reference photos, partly that I used for the demo, but then I give you the extra ones too in there. So you get all the same stuff. But yeah, that's how you could get the photos. Someday we might sell reference packs, but I don't know. I think we're good for now.
So Luis has another question.
Yes.
He says, "Hey Brian, would you mind explaining how to identify the difference in the upper brow structures? I don't know exactly when to change the lines that emerge from the glabella because it's easy to confuse those lines with the eyebrows."
Yeah, so you're talking about just like the brow structure?
Yeah, I think he's talking about like the structural lines versus
Yeah.
like where the actual eyebrow hair.
Yeah, that's
So-
tough because initially I try to ignore the eyebrows entirely. The thing I use the eyebrows for initially is figuring out where the brow line is going to sit. And the easiest way to do that is basically looking at where the eyebrows meet right in the center of the forehead, right? Notice where this eyebrow ends and where this one's about to start, or where this one starts and where this one starts is running right through that brow line that I put on there. So when I look at the reference, when I'm constructing the brow, I actually ignore the eyebrows except for right where they start. And the reason for that is because if we can find a skull, which I'm gonna have to stand up again, unfortunately. I don't know what that looks like on camera, but I'm gonna grab this skull. There we go. Right, notice that if you look at the skull from the side, right, we have like a big protrusion out this way. Our brow line runs through where the brow protrudes out the farthest, right? And that happens to a line right here. Notice there's like a weird little like flat spot right here. That flat spot, and you can usually feel it on your own forehead. Like if you actually just touch kind of where your eyebrow starts, you can kind of feel there's like a flat spot there, although on some people it's not very prominent. On other people it's very prominent. But there's like this little flat spot right here. Right here, that's where your eyebrows start. They start right there. And notice that pretty much lines up with like where that brow sticks out the farthest. So that's kind of usually what I'm looking for that brow line. That's basically it. From there, once I have that, I know that the eyebrows are usually going to arc up above that point, but not always, right? On some people, the eyebrows are very flat, like on my head. I don't know if you guys can see it, but I have very flat eyebrows. They don't really arc at all. So you just have to look at the person you're drawing and say, what type of person am I drawing? You know, is this a person with higher arching eyebrows, or is it a person with very flat eyebrows? And try and figure out which one best describes what's going on, you know? And then from there, I just kind of, I don't know, construct the brow basically off of this line, you know? And then earlier when I did this, and I did this rhythm line here, that didn't actually include the eyebrow. That was actually the brow bone itself. Now it wraps around. Again, if we look at this skull again, you know, like it gets more rounded out around here and like links back in. And then, yeah, and then the actual opening of the eye socket down here sits, as you can see, a little bit lower than these points, right? So you have this kind of flat spot. The opening of the eye socket sits a little bit lower. And then there's usually also skin and muscle and some like fat pad, different things sitting down under here. I push that point even a little bit lower. And that's where we get this other line, right? So notice, I don't know, I usually draw the eyebrows in after this part, but I don't know, I did it this way for some reason. But that's what this is the actual opening of the eye socket. It sits a little bit lower in here. Right about there. You know, and then from there we can figure out how the eyes kind of fit in there. You know, looking for the side plane of the nose. That's going to lead back to where our tear duct is going to sit, which is going to start right about here. And the other one sits roughly about here, the other tear duct. You know, and then we can just kind of hopefully drop the eyes in that space. But what I would recommend is just doing more eye studies, right? Because the more you learn about eyes and the more you draw them, the more you'll be able to hit these shapes really accurately. And she has kind of a difficult eye shape to draw. You know, it kind of comes up this way a bit. And then it kind of cuts over and drops down. Kind of fits right in that space. Now I'm angling it out a little bit and kind of making the planes a little more obvious, but her eye is more rounded than this. What I'm trying to show is that I'm using basically what you see on the Asaro head, right? Which is our 3 planes. You know, and you can kind of design people's eyes like this quite a bit. And then some people's eyes, those planes are actually really obvious. And other people, they're less obvious because they have more rounded eye shapes. But even those, I would usually start out kind of finding the planes a little bit and then rounding them back out. And then like in her case, right, like the corner of her eye sits higher. In fact, I might change that a little bit. Sits higher than the tear duct. So it's kind of coming, I guess that was all right. Basically sitting like this, right? Then we get the corner of the eye up in here, and then the bottom lid kind of drops down this way and back around. Connects to our tear duct up in here. Now that looks odd, but I think they'll make sense in a second, right? Because now we have to keep in mind that we have the thickness of the lids, right? Like the actual top or bottom plane of the top lid and the top plane of the bottom lid. And we're seeing a little bit of that here where it's kind of cutting through here and then connecting, and we're seeing some of the ball of the eye in here, right? And tear duct out here. You know, and then we're probably seeing a little bit of the thickness of the lid up in here a little bit. You know, and then from there we're seeing the thickness of the lower lid down around here, right? And then the lower lid itself, wrapping down around this way. It's very thin lower lid. You know, and then we get the upper lid wrapping up around here. It's basically tucking right up under this brow bone line that we made. If that ends up in the right spot, it should just kind of fit right up in here. And then kind of loop back around this way. You know, and then we're seeing the iris, of course, sitting in here. Just being really careful with that shape. Right, we got a little bit of the pupil in there, a little bit of the shadow from the upper lid as well. Sitting up in there like that. A little bit of a highlight up in here. It's kind of a dark highlight, but it's up in there. Notice I left the eyelashes off on purpose, just so we can talk about kind of the planes of the eye and the lid and how they're wrapping around things, you know. And it's important to understand that first, because adding eyelashes, once you get all that working, adding eyelashes on there isn't that tough. I can teach you that pretty fast. It's the underlying stuff that's hard to get right. this eye kind of wraps out around this way. Back up under here. Remember, it still has to tuck up under that brow bone right here. Kind of sits right up in there. You know, and then we're seeing some of the lid above here. All right, remember this connection point, and then this part wraps around, kind of cuts back up. It just kind of loops right up into that tear duct shape. You know, yeah.
I got a couple things for you.
Okay.
So, first of all, Luis says, thank you, Brian. And oh, by the way, don't forget some of my concerns about that drawing. Did he submit some
Oh, yeah, I
questions for you?
forgot. Man, I was going to print that out, and then I forgot to do it. Sorry,
Did you read
Louise.
it to you?
Yeah, it's on the Discord. I didn't actually get to it, but yeah.
Okay, while I find that, maybe you can give a quick answer to the previous question.
Yeah, which was
So-
what?
This is from Martina. I hope I'm saying that right. They say how to make good-looking cross-hatching, question mark. So, how do you do cross-hatching?
Man, that's a good question. Cross-hatching, I would recommend, there's a lot of different ways to do it, right? To study cross-hatching, I would recommend studying inking a little bit and getting like an inking book and figuring out the different ways that they do it. And yeah, I'm trying to think. I don't know that I do a lot of cross-hatching necessarily with the way that I teach. I definitely do a lot of hatching. And there's a couple things you have to think about, right? One is, are you going with the form or against the form? Or then you can also go like at 45 degrees to the form. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it, you know, but let's say we had, what am I trying to cross-hatch here? Some sort of shape. I don't know, it's kind of the sort of thing I draw in my demos sometimes is I just pick like a random shape and say, okay, we have like a curved surface, and let's say that's kind of rolling into shadow, right? So our shadow is going to be here, and then this side is in shadow. Here, we don't need any cross-hatching there. Right, so if our shadow is down here, right, if we're working in ink, this would basically be our starting point, is we would have this shape, you know, and this shape. Then we'd have to figure out like, well, this needs to be a soft edge. So we can come in here and basically kind of feather this out and move those like farther away, and it kind of starts to soften it a bit, right? But then that would be hatching essentially. And then you can do the same thing in the light as well, right? Like you can hatch in the light. I mean, you can do all different sorts of things with it. Ink is more limited because you only have black and white, you know, which is why it's good to study in ink. But if we're talking charcoal, I mean, I could do hatching all over this thing. But I got to think about, this is going against the form, right? This way is going to be with the form. And so we could also have maybe some coming out this way. You know, it starts getting more like a comic book type look, you know, but then the other ways we could, I don't know. I mean, there's so many different ways to do it. My recommendation would be to study like inking and comics a little bit if you really want to get into hatching, because they're like the masters of it, essentially, which is something I do want to teach in the future because I studied it for a while and it's something I really like. And I do want to do like I want to teach an inking class and like a comic book style figure drawing class that might end like with some inking or something. That's basically the idea, you know, and yeah, any luck with the Discord?
This is Luisa's question. So the first one is he's been struggling with soft edges since he doesn't know how dark they should be when filling the shadow shapes with tonal value.
Oh, yeah.
So do you want both questions at once, or do you want me to
No,
just give you that one?
I want them one at a time. Otherwise, I'm going to forget the next one.
Okay, gotcha.
But so the soft edges, like your soft edges are actually pretty good. Like when I looked at this, it didn't seem like it had a lot of edge problems other than, you know, you're dealing with a rougher paper, right? And I know I keep coming back to that, but you might have to do like a little bit of blending here and there. And as far as the value goes, part of that is just practice, right? Like I don't have your drawing right in front of me. Do you have it on the Discord? So I'm trying to remember what those values look like because my printer prints things too light. Yeah, so I usually, yeah. Yeah, like the value that you put down for the shadow works pretty well. Like I think you judged it pretty well, to be honest. Again, the places where it's too dark is more like in the eyebrows and in the eye a little bit, and probably in the lip, you're pushing a little bit too dark. You know, you want to be really, really careful where you use those darkest darks. And yeah, but I don't have a problem with the shadow values, right? Like the value that you started with, or at least it seems like you started with, which is kind of this value in here, works really well. If you had put that everywhere as your shadow value, I think it would have been good. Part of the reason it looks a little bit odd is because I think you didn't go dark enough in the hair, right? And so there's two things going on here that I think are making it look a little bit odd. One is you didn't go dark in the hair, right? She has dark hair and most of it is in shadow. So when you put dark hair in shadow, it gets really dark, right? So you could push that darkest dark like way out into here and up into here probably. Like the hair needs to be, you know, rendered and handled in a way where it's on its own value scale, kind of like a darker part of the value scale, which means it's going to be really dark. Once you do that, this value is suddenly going to seem a lot lighter than I think it does right now. And that's partly why this looks a little bit odd, is because you basically have the same value up around in here as you have in here. And it's not creating that contrast properly. The next thing is more of a, I don't know, like design element, right? Which is this shape right here. You have a shape here and a shape here. And they kind of look like they're like part of the hair. You know, like it looks like she has like, I don't know, like dual buns on each side, kind of like Chun-Li, you know, like the Street Fighter character. So that's a little bit odd and distracting. So I don't know, I think you can just kind of like get rid of those, stick with the hair shape. If you want to put a background on there, I mean, we could talk about backgrounds another time. You know, I mean, you can just do like a really simple little dark shape behind it, or you can go nuts and do something really complex like you see a lot of people do, which is cool. I mean, it can look really cool. But just having these two shapes here feels a little bit odd. It's like she has like Mickey Mouse ears on. Yeah, that's what I would say about the value and the edges. I think you're creating soft edges really well. You're pushing hard edges really well, but not always quite in the right spot. But usually, I mean, you're pushing harder edges up in here, up in here. I mean, that's pretty much where I would put them. I would just soften this lip a little bit, and the edges work good, you know? Again, I would recommend taking a look at Nathan Fowkes and Steve Houston. That's the other guy. And see how they work, because they use this type of supplies that you have. And I think you'll see, I can even find some videos of them probably. I think you'll see how they blend things and do things a little bit differently than I do. What was the next question?
Next question was, let's see. So, Louise is laughing. I'm not sure why.
Okay. Probably because of the hair shapes.
Oh, yeah, probably. Okay, yeah, I see that now. Okay, so this is, oh, he also says thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, and then Martina asked a little while back, she asked, my figure drawing often ends up looking like an analytic chart rather than a cool drawing. Any tips on how to prevent that?
Part of that is just practice and experience, because you kind of have to go through, I don't know, when I was at Watts, it was always called the generic phase, right? And so everybody goes through a stage where you get competent at drawing heads, but they're not that interesting, right? They're like very generic and like, yeah, everything's proportioned well, everything looks pretty cool, or is like in the right spot, you know, you got the perspective right, but it just doesn't look like awesome, you know, like it just kind of looks okay. And that's, you know, when you get into that generic head phase, which is a phase that literally everybody has to go through, right? Because it's just the way our brain learns. Like you have to go through, you know, learn all the parts first and then learn how to put them all together. And then over time, as you do that over and over and it starts to become more intuitive, you'll kind of just naturally start to make things a little bit more interesting. And part of that comes from learning to bend the rules. Like it's one of those situations where, you know, you got to learn the rules first and then you can kind of change them up as needed. But you don't know how far you can push that at first. You don't even know that you can push it at all, you know, and how to push it can only be learned by learning those rules and then figuring out, you know, when they're broken and when to stick with them and that kind of thing. So part of that I would say is, you know, keep practicing, don't stop. And I think you'll find that most of that, I don't know, stiffness or genericness to your drawings is probably coming from the fact that you're still at the point where you have to put a lot of thought and effort just getting everything into the right spot, right? Once you do that long enough, what happens is it starts to free up brain power to think about other things, you know, because when you're first starting, just thinking about getting the eyes in the right spot or the mouth, it takes up literally all your brain power and there's none left for anything else, you know? And so, yeah, you'll end up with a reasonably competent drawing, but isn't like, you know, something people are going to pay a bunch of money for. But as you do this over and over and you get to the point where it starts becoming more intuitive and you don't have to think about it, then suddenly you'll start to realize that, oh, wait a minute, while I'm doing this, everything just kind of goes in the right place automatically. Like it just starts to happen intuitively. And all of a sudden you have a bunch of brain power freed up for thinking about things like design. You know, and you'll reach a point where all of a sudden you're like, you know what? I can actually spend some time thinking about like how I want to design this nose or this shadow shape, or, you know, and it unleashes like a whole nother world of problem solving that you have to master, which is kind of how drawing goes. There's like levels of difficulty. And every time you master one, it like unlocks the next level of difficulty. And all of a sudden you realize like, oh my gosh, there's so much more to this. And, but then eventually, you know, you get through all of it. I don't know about all of it. I don't think anybody gets through all of it, but it gets easier over time. Hopefully that makes sense. I should probably put a hairline on here. I don't know. Somehow I turned her head, I think, a little bit more than it is in the reference.
Oh, and then
Yeah.
There's another question from Luis. Actually, two more.
Okay.
So he says the other question was in relationship to the outlining on the far side of the head.
Yeah.
I don't really know how to outline the far side accurately. And I think he's saying that was his.
You're talking about this stuff out here, I'm guessing.
I think so, yeah. I struggle with that too, actually.
It's tough, and it's something that I struggled with for a long time. I think everybody does. The tendency, usually, and it was certainly my tendency and something I see in most students, is to overdo it, right? And to over-design this outline. And it should really be very, very subtle. You know, like, I don't know, I wouldn't say I captured her likeness perfectly here, but you can see at the very least, this is pretty subtle, right? Like it's not not super active. And change it a little bit there. I don't know. That's the best way I can describe it is don't overdo it. Keep it more subtle than it looks in the reference, right? Because it is so easy to exaggerate that far edge out here. And I tend to do it all the time. And, you know, I've been doing this a long time, so I know to be aware of it, and I'll go back and fix it. But it is easy to do, I will say. It is very easy to exaggerate. And that's usually where the problem comes from. And there's actually one of these that somebody turned in that is exactly what I was going to talk about. I think it was this one, because this is such an awesome drawing. Like, the rendering is so good. And yet, partly the features are a little too exaggerated, and then this outline, this contour is like really exaggerated. You know, so I was going to talk about keeping it subtle, essentially, and keeping it like really simple if you can. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. I don't know. I feel like that wasn't the best answer in the world, but...
He has one more question.
Okay.
So he said, he has another question. Sorry for overwhelming you. He
No.
says, how should be the shadow mapping on the lower lid? Should the edges be hard?
They should be soft, but in a very small way, if that makes sense. So, like, if you zoom in there, like what I drew is fairly hard edges because this is more like construction oriented. You know, but you can see I was starting to soften it up down here a little bit. You can have a pretty hard edge along here, right, where you get that little bit of light on like the top plane of the lower lid. We'll see. I could probably map this a little bit softer because this kind of moves into shadow back here. Right, and this kind of pulls up around this way. So it's not like a hard edge, but it's not the softest edge either because it's a very small form. Even though it's a little bit rounded, it's tiny. You know, and then I would keep the edges underneath here a little bit harder because that's where the form kind of ends and bumps back into the cheek. But yeah, that's the idea. Mostly what I would say is they're very specific shapes. You got to get the shape first, or the shape right first. And then you can kind of mess with the edges here and there as needed. You know, if you just don't go too dark, you can kind of adjust them and play with them a little bit. There's a little bit of room for error. But most of these eyes are in shadow. In fact, her eyes are almost entirely in shadow. You know, so that would all get filled in. Anyway, we should go move to the next one, probably.
Okay. I'm going to switch the reference.
Oh, yeah, that would be good.
Okay.
Forgot about the reference.
All right. Good job, Luis.
Yeah, excellent job, Luis. I think your drawing looks really good. I mean, it's never going to look quite like mine because of the supplies that you're using are a little bit different, but you're understanding the concepts, I think, very well, which is even more impressive if you're using different supplies. Oh, sorry, it's drawn down here on the neck.
Which reference is for the next one?
That one.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think that's that one.
And just to give you an idea of time, we're at like 2 hours right now.
Okay.
So this might be a 3-hour stream.
This is going to keep going.
Yeah.
We're going to do 2 more. I'll try and go a little bit faster if I can.
Okay.
Mostly on this neck, I just wanted to get the bottom part of the shadow down here, right? Because we have this like shadow here, but it doesn't have a place where it ends. It's actually a cast shadow. Drops down here, hits the collarbone a little bit, and then kind of cuts back up this way and gets really soft. It's pretty soft back here too.
Luis says says thank you so much and that he appreciates it.
Ah, you're welcome. Thanks for giving me some stuff to critique. But anyway, just closing off that shadow, right? So we have like a complete shape here, although I guess the rest of that hair shape in there as well. Okay, next is this one. And whose was this? I forgot her name.
Julia.
Julia.
Right?
I think so.
Double check.
We're going to double check.
I'm pretty sure it's Julia.
Okay, let me get the reference on my computer.
I feel bad if I was wrong. Yes, Julia Pfeiffer, I think is
Oh,
her
good.
last name.
Okay, Julia, welcome. I know we've been doing this for a while, but we're going to work on yours next. Hopefully you're still here. If not, you can always rewatch this later. So what I'm seeing right off the bat, let me zoom in here a little bit. In comparison to the reference, I feel like partly the eyes could be designed a little bit better. I feel like this eyebrow is arcing up really high, right? Like you're almost kind of reversing her expression a little bit, you know, where she has a tilt to her head, right? So everything's tilted. And yet when we look at where her eyebrows peak, they're actually kind of level, which tells me that this one is actually arcing up a little bit higher than this one. And you kind of have it almost like the opposite way a little bit, you know? And I feel like the shape, the overall shape might be a little bit long. And it's mostly it. I mean, you're starting to capture the nose a little bit, and you're kind of like breaking down the planes of the nose, which is working pretty well, and it's her nose type. You know, same with the lips. I think they're working good. We'll redesign them a little bit, but they're basically in the right spot, right size, that kind of thing. It's mostly the brow and like the eyes and the big shape that I think we can work on a little bit. So this is another situation where I've never drawn her before. She looks really familiar. She's got to be like in some TV show or something I watch, because definitely recognize her from something. Okay, so let's find, again, our cranial mass. Her head's tilted down a little bit as well. So that is actually going to elongate the cranial mass a little bit, right? So we can get like a slightly longer shape this way. Now, I think you made her head a little bit too tall. And then I think that middle third is probably long, but let me see. She has a pretty long middle third in the reference too, I think. Yeah, she's definitely a person that has like kind of a longer middle third section. So let's see if we can capture this big shape. It's going to kind of come down this way. Down this way. Right, then we got to get that jaw on there. And I think we can maybe play it down a little bit. I think this angle, I think part of what's going on is these angles are a little bit too extreme. Right, I think it's a little bit more subtle of an angle. Kind of like that. Let's see if that works. Okay, so now keep in mind that the features are going to have to move, right? Because once we change the big shape of the head, it kind of moves everything. But this is critical, right? I mean, that beginning stage is really critical. So I think you have a little bit too much of a tilt. I think you angled the center line a little bit far, right? So I think we can pull it back up a little bit. a little more upright. Maybe even a little more upright than that. Let's try that. Okay, so keep in mind, if her head's tilted down a little bit, that's going to push the hairline down a little bit. Probably around here. You know, and so we're seeing more of the top plane of the head, right? Obviously, if I leave my head forward, I mean, you end up seeing, you know, the top of it. So, let's see here. We get hairline kind of wrapping around here, here. Her ear sits out here and is a little bit larger. A little bit wider, I guess. We're just seeing a little bit more of it. So again, I mean, this right here is, in my opinion, by far the hardest part of the whole thing. And it's something that I have spent a ton of time practicing over the years, is creating these big head shapes. Because everything kind of builds off of this. Right now, I feel like we have a little too much space over here, but maybe not, because she has a very narrow side plane section. We're actually seeing a little bit of the side plane over here, right? Because remember, the head works in a weird way where it's wider in the back than in the front. So when we look at it from the front, we actually see a little bit of the sides. And her head isn't turned quite far enough to totally get rid of this other side over here. We're seeing just like a little bit of it. Seems about right. So let's see if we can capture those thirds. This is a challenging piece of reference. Let's see, I might move this hairline up. Actually, I don't know, maybe it's fine. So let's see, she has a small forehead. Measure this again. Well, actually, kind of take it back. She fits those thirds pretty well. What's going on with the forehead is when you have somebody with a widow's peak, right, where you get like, you're like, here's our head shape, center line, right, and then you're like, well, our hairline is up here, right? The widow's peak drops below that line on people that have it. You know, so the measurement on her, it looks like she has a small forehead, but the truth is the measurement for the forehead, I think, sits a little bit up here, and then her hair kind of does this. Has like a little bit of that shape to it, sort of like that. Just to make things a little more complicated, right? But then I would break the head into thirds from this point up here, and then the chin, right? So I have to do this. And notice I'm keeping that angle more subtle, much more subtle. Let's see, let's measure these. Oh, that's still way too big. Okay. That's not going to work. Try again. It's pretty close. Boom, boom. I think I'm going to go with it. It's going to sit right in there. Now, her glabella shape is very long, thin. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it kind of does this. It does like that, sort of. And then just hits her nose. from this angle is going almost straight up and down that way. Right, her other eye socket kind of sits in here, at least the inside of it. Right, remember we need to lock our brow shapes, our brow shape together here. And her head's tilted down, so the corner, the back corner of the socket isn't going to go very low. It's going to flatten out it because we're looking down at her a little bit. Eye sockets are shaped kind of like that. Right, this one comes in this way. Down. Actually, no. I don't know. The other one sits in there like that somewhere. You know, her nose. Sorry. Just want a quick, like a line that helps align the eyes real quick is what I'm looking for. Just gonna sit kind of right about there. Right, and now the nose needs to be really, really subtle. This is good. Like if you're at a point where you're doing a lot of nose studies and you're trying to work out the planes, then doing this is probably a good idea. But her nose is very subtle. At least with this type of lighting, especially. So kind of like that. Sit right in there, maybe be even a little bit more narrow. It's a very thin nose shape. You know, remember we're going to break this bottom third into thirds. Boom. Pretty close. I angled these a little bit too much though. Pull them back. Now, as you can see, we're going to have to adjust the shape of the chin and jaw just a little bit. But this is kind of what I would start with, right? Her other glabella shape, again, is very narrow coming in this way. You know, opening of the eye socket is tough. You can't see it on her very clearly. She has like, what do you call it, like an epicanthic fold, which is where the crease above the upper eyelid kind of merges with the tear duct. Her eye is going to sit right about in there. And she fits that kind of stereotypical Loomis thing where you can draw a line up from the edge of the nostril that matches the angle of the nose, and it'll lead you back to the tear duct, right? Which will be about here, tear duct here, and tear duct here. Not everybody's head fits that. I know Loomis teaches that, and he's like, here's how you draw a head. truth is, I don't know about most people, but a lot of people don't fit that. Their noses are wider. It's too wide to make that work, you know. And in my experience, that's more common than not. Okay, so that's looking okay.
There's a few questions.
Okay.
One of them is most related to the drawing, so I'm going to give you that one first.
Okay.
So this one is from, I'm not sure how to say their username, like
Yeah.
Feish maybe? But anyways, they ask, what points are you looking at to start start over. Okay. What points are you looking at to start to determine the tilt of the head?
There's a couple of things I look at to determine the tilt, which is tough. You have to be really careful because it's very common for people to have one eyebrow that sits or like peaks a little bit higher than the other. That happens on a lot of people. And so it creates the impression that there's more of an angle than there is when that happens. I see that a lot, and that throws a lot of people off. So what I'm looking for specifically is where the eyebrows meet in the center of the forehead, right? So like those 2 points of the eyebrow exactly, and then also the tear ducts and the pupils, right? And because those usually stay pretty level, depending, there's some people that are a little bit different. Like if you look at someone like Jeff Bezos, where he has like one big eye socket that sits higher and one little eye socket that sits lower, I mean, that's going to make it not work, but then you just have to learn to recognize, you know, those head types and how to adjust for them. But like in this case, what I'm looking for mostly is the tear ducts and the pupils, and kind of just holding my pencil up between those points and using that to judge the angle. And I may have angled it even a little bit too much. It's pretty close, you know, and then those points on the eyebrows. But in this case, she has one eyebrow that arcs a lot higher than the other. So if you were to look at her eyebrows, it kind of creates the impression that there's not much of a tilt when there really is, you know, so you have to really pay attention to that. And I wonder if we can show, because there was a second piece of reference. You can show that one real quick.
Yes.
Was it Julia that turned this in?
Yes.
Yeah, I just picked one of your drawings because I knew these were going to take a long time, and felt like I wasn't going to have time. Yeah, that one, right? You can see how she has 2 very different eyebrows in that photo. I think this is the same girl. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think so. And yeah, but you can tell, right? She has one that sits much higher than the other, but they both start about level, right at that point where they like meet right in the middle of the forehead, and then one angles up at a different angle than the other one. You know, so if you were to just look at the eyebrows and kind of try and judge the angle, you'd probably get it wrong. You know, so that's why I kind of look more at the tear ducts and pupils because they don't move as much. They tend to be more stable. Anyway, you can change it back. Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah.
Good question. There were some other questions that seem like they would be really long to answer.
Yeah.
I don't want to sidetrack you, so that's the only reason I'm not bringing them up for everybody watching. Because there are people who have asked a bunch of questions, which, you know, we want to get to everyone's questions, but we've spent like an hour on each, you know, on each drawing, so I'm trying to keep...
I'm not the fastest, talker or drawer, which is good for teaching because it really makes things more accessible, but it doesn't make them fast.
Yeah. So, for everyone who's waiting for a question to be answered, if it's about specifically what Brian's drawing, I'll ask it right away, and then I'll kind of wait on the other ones, because I want him to be able to get through this drawing, and then also we have one more drawing at the end that we're going to get to.
Yeah, I want to do one more.
But, yeah, we're beyond the 2-hour mark, so I do want to keep us on track with time. I mean, as on track as we can be at this point.
Yeah. She has those like very like Vanderpool, like Cupid's bow type shaped lips. You know, so you can draw like that stereotypical lip shape on her. And it should work pretty well.
Oh, there's a follow-up from that person who had the question about the tilt.
Yeah.
They said, that's so interesting. I've mainly tried to determine the tilt by imagining a vertical line through the head, but it makes sense to look at the horizontal to find the tilt too. I will try this out. Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, try it. I mean, I think your way works too. I would just do both. I mean, I frequently, like, I do the same thing, right? Like, I don't know why I didn't mention that, but that's basically what I did here was I looked for the tilt of the center line first, and then I kept everything else like perpendicular to it. But the problem is if you have a lot of perspective on the head, that doesn't work quite as well, you know, because it just depends. Like in this case, like, you know, it was a pretty good photo. So whoever took this photo, or if it was a movie screenshot still, whatever, it was shot from farther away and then they zoomed in. And that flattens out the head and it flattens out the perspective. So there's not like a ton of perspective distorting things in this image. So that works fine, right? I can just make these perpendicular to our center line and everything works. But if you have a head where there's more perspective on it, you know, we have like this box shape. So here's our head. Kind of doing this. Maybe it's more extreme. Make the perspective more extreme. You know, and then if we start picking up a lot of perspective, it gets odd a little bit. You know, like these lines will change depending on the perspective. And so that doesn't work quite as well. Hang on, did that wrong. You know, so in this instance, if we had a center line here, you know, these aren't exactly perpendicular to that line. Anyway. So just be careful with it. But in this case, yeah, I think that would totally work. Right, our chin sits down here, so I'm going to start adjusting that jawline because it doesn't feel quite right. But remember, like I was saying earlier, you have to just be incredibly careful with these outlines. As soon as you exaggerate it even a little bit, it's not going to look right. You know, and if anything, you want it to actually be more subtle than you think it is in the reference. I mean, they just got to be incredibly careful. You know, just got a little bit of chin showing down here. This is a little bit rounded down here. Again, super, super subtle. I may have even exaggerated it too much. You know, here you get some of her jaw kind of pulling in this way, and then it kind of pops back out just a little bit, but then we get a much more rounded shape than I have here. Right, so we've got to round this back out. Let it sit a little bit more like that, maybe. You know, our neck kind of dropping down this way. Hair is running back up around here in terms of like the part in her hair, right? And then we have hair kind of coming up from that little widow's peak section, and then it kind of wraps around her forehead this way, and then back behind the ear here. And then it's basically just wrapping kind of like back behind there. Ear hanging out there, other ear is kind of over here. Just seeing like a little bit of it over there. Okay, so let's get some nostril shapes. Again, her head's tilted down, so keep in mind, like, we're not seeing a lot of the bottom plane of her nose, so these shapes are going to be very thin from this angle, right? They're going to be practically flat. About like that. Very thin shapes. Maybe even a little more rounded. Right, and then we just got to get those eyebrows on there and eyes. And that's going to be tricky. Again, those eyebrows are going to be tough because they're angled a little bit odd. So her eye shapes are interesting too, right? Because again, she has kind of that epicanthic fold. And that's something that we'll have to consider. So her tear duct is going to sit like right about in here. And then it's kind of connecting up around this way. Right? And then out from under there, we get the actual, eye lid coming out across this way. I think kind of like that, right? And then that epicanthic fold is causing that crease up above the eye to lock down into the tear duct. You know, so it's going to sit back out this direction. And then her eye, like the corner of the eye, is sitting higher than the tear duct. And then it's cutting back down this way. It's probably a little too narrow. I don't know, maybe it's right. I always have a tendency to draw eyes a little bit big. I think because I started out wanting to draw comic books a lot. They tend to use pretty big eyes. Not always, but sometimes. Her eye's going to sit like right up in there. Right, so we have the lid wrapping into here, and then the ball of the eye sitting right up in there. And that's basically it. Right, we can add that iris in there, which is all the way off to the side over here. Kind of sitting like this. Get that little pupil shape in there. So I think that kind of works. It's a little bit odd without eyebrows right now, but we'll get that in a minute. So same thing over here, right? We get the tear duct starting about here, and then we just kind of have to know how these shapes are going to work. Partly just through studying a lot of eyes. Right, so we get that kind of crease up above there, and then the lid coming out from under there. It's a challenging eye to draw. Right, and then on this side is dropping down. Wrapping back around. Again, get some of the ball of the eye and the tear duct showing in there. Right, maybe a little bit. That far plane. And then a little bit of that lower lid, which is really thin from this angle. And then we just kind of drop the other iris in there. I'd set it roughly about like that. It's not the greatest pupil shapes I've ever drawn, but I think it kind of gets the point across. You know, and then we just kind of layer those eyebrows on there. And it's tough, right? Like you have to decide, do we want to keep that one being a lot bigger than the other? And, you know, how important is that likeness? We're going to get this one up here. And it's kind of wrapping up this way. Actually, pretty cool eyebrow shapes. Kind of comes across here, and then it arcs back up this way. You know, it goes way up there.
I just want to mention we are at about 2.5 hours.
Okay.
So if we wanted to do the last one, you know, like split the last hour in half, then it's about time to switch.
Okay, I'm going to draw one more eyebrow and then we can switch.
Okay, cool.
This is tough. I'm going to bend this one a little bit to kind of match this one. Also wrap it back that way. These are difficult eyebrows because they're so different. Like I feel like they're not, even if I copy exactly what's there, it might not look quite right in the drawing. And that happens sometimes, right? And then you have to decide like, well, is this like a major part of this person's likeness? Do I really need to get it in there? Can I change it? Can I don't know, you just got to decide what you want to do. You know, if it's somebody like Harrison Ford and you draw the nose really crooked and you're like, that doesn't look right, but that's how you know it's Harrison Ford, is he has the crooked nose. So you got to put it in. Okay, I'm not going to worry about the ear right now. Anyway, that's basically it. That is kind of how I would handle that, I think. I think I drew the eyes a little bit big, if I'm being honest. Just a little bit, not a lot, but I don't know. For the first time ever drawing this person, I think I did okay. It's always hard to draw someone for the first time. Also helps to get the hair on there. I don't know. I don't want to draw the hair. I guess we're out of time. Cool. Cool. Anyway, that's pretty much it for that one. So Julia, I think that was your name. You did really well. These look really cool. I wish I had time to do all three. I'll save the other two you sent in, and next time we do this, I can probably add them in there. Because they look like they'd be fun to work on. You found cool reference photos. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which is this one, right? Which has incredible rendering. Rendering on here is awesome. You know, what I would focus on, in fact, what I would say is the rendering, and keep in mind, like my printer prints things a little bit too light, right? So like I have your drawing up on the computer. That's kind of what I'm judging the values off of when I talk about the values. So if you look at this and you're like, oh, those values aren't right, that's not what I drew. You're right, because my printer printed too light. It's, but your values are actually a little bit too dark in the shadows, I would say. It works pretty well for the most part, but I think you could just, on her face at least, and the hair, though, they work really well. But in the face, I would go just a little bit lighter in the shadows. That's just me. But to me, what really needs to happen here is more construction oriented, right? Because it's not looking quite like her. It's almost a little bit like a caricature of her, you know, where you're kind of exaggerating things a little bit here and there. Partly the nose shape, I think, got a little too big. The eyes, I think, are actually a little bit too small, maybe. But it's hard to tell right now with the other features too big. So we'll have to kind of like adjust them a little bit at the same time. And then what I really want to talk about is contour, right? Because this is the one where, you know, someone was asking about, like, what do you do about that outline of the head? And I was saying, keep it really, really simple and don't exaggerate it. And that's kind of what's going on here, right? Is you're really pushing this overlap a lot, and then you're really pushing the chin back this way, right? So it's got like this big S curve in here, and I don't really see that in the reference photo much, right? Like, yeah, the lip, like the 2-cylinder kind of pushes forward in front of this back part a little bit, but it's very subtle, and this back part is basically a straight line, right? Like, I'm not seeing this huge curve that you have in here. And so we're gonna need to basically just do those things, right? Adjust the features to be the size we need them to be, and then be really, really careful with those contours, and see if we can get that to work. As far as the big shape of the head goes, it's not bad. Let's see. Let's see, find kind of our cranial mass shape. Right, looking for that big shape of the head, always working from big shapes to small shapes, right? And keeping things simple if we can. You know, and keeping these marks kind of light and loose. We got to be able to move them around if we need to. Trying to keep the big shape about the same as yours. So I don't think it was very far off, if at all, really. It's more just a contour issue. Right, chin kind of sits right down there. Right, that center line, so her like kind of 2-cylinder and jaw are kind of like pushed forward quite a bit. So we have to be really careful when we consider where the center line is going to go. There's just different head types, right? Some people, everything lines up on that center line perfectly, and then other head types, the jaw and like the connection point of the nose and the 2-cylinder are all kind of shifted forward of the center line a little bit. And so you just have to kind of learn to recognize exactly what's going on there. Right, so I'm going to pull this here, right, because she's got her head tilted down a little bit. All right, I'm going to say center line goes about there. Back of the ear, or sorry, back of the jaw, front of the ear. I think it's going to go back here, and I think we could tilt it a little bit more, just that ear shape, right? And kind of push this connection point forward a little bit. Right now on yours, the jaw feels very long and very kind of square, right? But her jaw type, it is long, definitely, but it's tough because in the photo, this whole area is lost in shadow. We can't see exactly what's going on in there. I think, even if I zoom in there, I got too many smudges on my laptop screen. It's hard to see. But it's tough to see exactly what's happening, right? So I can see that I think the ear sits at more of a tilt, which kind of tells me that that's probably going to push the corner of the jaw forward a little bit as well. But it just depends on the person. I don't know. But that's my guess based on, I don't know, stuff. Okay, her hairline, remember we have that change in plane and forehead. Her hairline sits kind of low on that change in plane. And so part of what I'm seeing here, right, is I feel like the features are too big. They're taking up too much of the head, you know, and so we need to shrink them down. And I think part of where that's coming from maybe is we can push the hairline down a little bit, and then all those features are going to have to shrink to kind of match that new face shape. You drew some really cool eye shapes. I think they're just maybe a little bit small, but we'll see when we get to that part. Okay, so hairline, I'm going to say sits about here. I'm going to move it down a little bit, right? Because her forehead kind of comes up and it just starts to go back and then we hit her hair, right? So it's kind of like right about there. I'm going to add that angle to it, which maybe I need to angle a little bit less. I don't think it should be quite perpendicular. I know we were talking earlier about judging the angle of the brow by kind of using the center line. And I mentioned like the perspective can change things and make that difficult sometimes to rely on. The other thing that changes it is an up or down tilt, right? If I tilt my head down, if we tilt a head down, oops, first off, we get more cranial mass. So we get like a bigger cranial mass shape. Right, we get something kind of like that. And then say our center line now, since the head is tilted down, now the center line tilts as well, right? Because if we tilt the head down, that's going to angle the center line. But the problem is if the head's tilted down, but there's no side-to-side tilt, what we end up with is a tilted center line, but flat brow line and nose line and chin, right? And that's sort of how we create that down tilt. Anyway, back to this thing here. Yeah, so I think the brow and eyes and stuff won't be tilted quite as much as the center line in this case. Now, I think she has kind of a small forehead compared to our typical third. Actually, no, I kind of take it back. Now that I'm measuring, she fits those thirds almost exactly. So let's go in here and find those thirds. That doesn't seem quite right. Try again. Just down a little bit more. Just down a little bit more. Seems close. Okay, that's pretty much right on. It's going pretty good. So let's see here. Her nose shape is kind of like a longer glabella shape. Kind of coming down this way. The inside of this eye socket. over here, right? We get the brow. As her head tilts down, it's going to flatten out, right? It's not going to be angled a lot. It's going to be kind of a flatter shape. And then we're not seeing much here. It's not going to like kind of link over exactly because her head's turned pretty far. We can certainly find a little bit of the forehead. Kind of where the brow bone is going to sit. All right, kind of like that. And then kind of the edge of this eye socket over here. This side is turned far enough that the eye is overlapping the brow shape, right? So we're actually getting some overlap in here now where the eye is kind of protruding out in front of the brow. And then we get the cheekbone kind of coming back out on that side of it. Right, so before I draw too much more of that, I want to get the nose shape on here because we have to make sure the relationship between the cheek back behind there and the nose works perfectly. Otherwise, this whole thing's going to fall apart. All right, so the sweep of her nose kind of comes down this way a little bit, and then it comes out this way a little bit. Now, using a quick plumb line, the very edge of the nose over here is going to sit kind of under where like the pupil would be. It's kind of right about there. So I'm going to try and capture that nose shape. I think if we were to like zoom in there and really look at this reference, maybe we're seeing just a tiny, tiny bit of the far nostril, but I'm going to ignore that because there's not enough of it there to really affect a whole lot. Back nostril kind of sits around that way. Side plane of the nose, leading back to our tear duct. Eyes are going to sit about here. Opening of the eye socket sits a little lower down here. Right, kind of up under there. Probably close off this shape maybe. And so that's working pretty well, right? You can see how much space we're seeing back here. It's not perfect, but it's reasonably close, I feel like. And so now we can get that cheekbone to drop down. It's basically going to be, it's going to be a little bit rounded here. And it's almost a straight line down this way to the chin. Now, we can't see what's happening on the other side of the lips exactly, but we can see where the chin sits, and it basically just lines up right in through there. You know, it's got to be just right. I can also, again, break this bottom third into thirds, although, let me check real quick. That might not work exactly with her.
There was a question asked a while ago that's
Yeah.
kind of related to the eye socket. Are you still drawing the eye socket? I'm a little behind
No,
on
but whatever.
the live
Yeah.
feed on YouTube.
Yeah,
is
yeah.
a little behind. But Muji asked a little while ago, probably like 15 minutes ago or so, what exactly is the shape for the eye socket and how to bend it depending on the perspective? So maybe you could kind of touch on that really quick.
Yeah, the eye socket is tough. It's a tough shape to capture, like, properly. It would take me a while to explain exactly. Trying to think of the best way to explain it. So like everybody's eye sockets are different. So once you kind of learn generically like how the eye socket works, then you'll start to be able to determine like things like this, right? Like where does the opening of the eye socket sit versus where I put this line for the part of the brow bone that sticks out the farthest, right? And part of that has to do with just assessing like what's going on with an individual person, right? Some people, train back there, some people this line would go all the way up and meet this line almost. Other people, you have a lot of space right here. You know, this basically, this upper part is based off of how the brow bone itself works, right? Like if we look at the skull, it's essentially mimicking it. And I have a skull back here. Yeah. But as you can see, this is our skull. But essentially what's happening is like our brow line runs right through this point here and here, right? Where these two flat parts are, which is right where the eyebrow starts, right? But notice that isn't the same as the opening down in here, right? It's like above it a little bit, you know? So that's kind of where we get this second line from. First one runs through the eyebrows right where they start and where these two flat parts are. And those points are the points that like protrude out the farthest. Then the opening sits kind of like a little bit lower, but it depends on the person, right? On this skull in particular, it's not much lower. It's very close. This would be a person where you would have a very little space in here, you know? Some people, though, you have really thick, prominent brow bones, and you get a lot of space there. You know, some people, like, I don't know, I'm kind of designing this section down here. I wouldn't worry about that too much. Part of that is just based on what I think looks cool a little bit in a design phase. And it's tough. It's a tough question to answer because the truth is, like, what you really have to do is study the generic version of those eye sockets and how to design the brow bone over and over. And once that starts to become more intuitive, then you can start to really focus on how to change it, how to change them and make them look like specific, like individual people, you know, because there's so much variety and so many different head types and people out there that it's impossible to teach something that works on everybody. You can't. Instead, they teach, you know, the way drawing is taught is like you kind of learn a lot of generic stuff. And then once that generic stuff begins to make sense and you kind of ingest it and understand it in your own way, then suddenly you're able to kind of use it to your advantage a little bit more and start to bend and change things and say like, you know what, on this person, their brow kind of actually goes this other way a little bit. And then you'll just try it and see if it works. And eventually you'll reach a point where you do stuff like that and your decision making works out. And you're like, oh my gosh, this actually looks pretty cool. Glad I changed that. I don't know. I don't think that answers your question, but unfortunately, like to actually, I would have to do like a full like brow lesson, which I do in my demos a lot. I mean, if you take like the fundamental class or the 20-minute heads class or even the head drawing class, I mean, all of them, I start out more talking about construction and how to get that to work. I just dropped my eraser. Oh, no, good. It didn't go far. And yeah, I don't know. Something to think about. Trying to capture this shape a little bit better. It's a tough shape to capture. that's kind of it. I think that works. Good enough for now. Okay, so let's get back to the rest of this head. Right, so her lips are, her head's turned far enough that the 2-cylinder is kind of pushing outward and overlapping this cheek out here. But we have to figure out how to not exaggerate that too much, right? Like your overlaps work well. You have the right idea. It's just very exaggerated, right? So we have to find a way more subtle way of doing this and then really make sure to not exaggerate the shape of this chin here. So her 2-cylinder is kind of pushing, find a quick rhythm here. Find the lip shape. Find the philtrum. And her lips kind of do this and then swing back this way. Needs to be more subtle. I exaggerated that too much. It's very easy to exaggerate stuff. And there's times where you want to, right? Like the whole reason we train with reference specifically is to learn to not exaggerate stuff too much. And it also gives us like a common goal. Like I can critique and do head inventions and stuff, but I don't know, like if you turn in a head invention and you're like, hey, can you critique this? I can tell you if something's way off, but I don't know what type of person you had in mind when you were starting, and exactly what your goals were. So the reference kind of helps with that a little bit. It gives us like a common goal. Again, just trying to keep this really subtle. Right, and then we get the bottom lip coming out from under here. Wrapping down around this way. And again, this has to overlap that line that we put there for the side of the head just right. And I'm guessing we're seeing like some of the split in the lip right there, probably. If I can draw it. I don't know, that looks weird. Get rid of that. And then we get the chin dropping back from here. Back down this way. Wrapping back around under here. Feels a little bit better. right? So that feels a little bit less exaggerated, right? So you can see what I'm talking about in terms of this being really pushed. I mean, you have like an actual corner right there, you know, and the chin being pulled back really far. And subtlety is key. And, you know, you're probably looking at this saying like, well, I can kind of see where it bends. And you're right. It does a little bit in there. But we need to do it in a way that is just incredibly careful, right? So if we want to include some of that, right, we got to go in here and kind of modify it, but it's just super, super carefully, right? Like round this out a little bit. Just very subtly, and then add just the most subtle change right in there. And I'd say that matches kind of what's going on with her a little bit better. You know, the next thing is the eyebrows, but you got the eyebrows on there pretty well. We could draw the eyes first too, because the eyes I think could use a little bit of adjusting. And I don't know, your eye shapes are actually pretty good. I think it was mostly the other features being so big and the face being too tall that was kind of making the eyes seem big. But now we're going to have to shift them down a little bit to match our new face shape. But they work basically the same way as the other eyes I've been drawing, which is we get the tear duct. In this case, they're going to pop up and over. A little bit of room for the eyelid up above there. Basically just fit right in that space. Just kind of drop them in there. Right, then we get the same thing as before, where we're seeing up into here and a little bit of the ball of the eye and the tear duct. Kind of make it look like that eye's actually turned. You know, maybe get a little bit of the, just a little bit of that top plane of the lower lid in there. I don't know. I don't know if we really need that or not. And there's a little bit of a crease under there, which again, could probably leave that out and it'd be fine. So we get that kind of shape. And then on this eye, we get a very specific shape here that is going to start with our tear duct. It's going to come up over this direction and wrap out and around the ball of the eye. Seems a little tall, but honestly, that's kind of how it looks in the reference. But that's never a good reason to do something. Right? We need it to make sense logically in our drawing. If something looks strange in your drawing, and then you look at the reference and you think like, well, that's how it looks in the reference, and then you just leave it that way, it's probably not going to look right. Right, we're looking up into that little bit of eyelid right up in there. We get some eyelid wrapping around the side. One thing you'll see me draw a lot is Gosh, I wonder if I can find it. Hang on. Shouldn't have to go back very far. There's ears. Mouths. Noses. Almost there. Sorry, I just taught like a facial feature class. I'm looking for the eye demo. There it is. There we go. So this was my demo from the eye week of the facial feature class. And you can see kind of how these shapes, right? We have to like basically master how that eyelid, which has a thickness to it, wraps around the ball of the eye is the whole idea. You know, and practicing what that looks like. What do the planes look like? How, if we were wrapping a contour line around here, how would that work? You know, understanding the ball of the eye, how the cornea, or not the cornea, the iris, right, is kind of like dish shaped a little bit concave. And then the cornea sticks out the other way. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff, you know, that you have to know. You know, what happens if we look up at the eye, if we look down at the eye? How do we fit eyes into the eye socket once we know all that stuff? You know, what happens if we're to the eye shapes themselves, right? Notice if we look straight at someone, they kind of do this. If their eyes are looking that way or if their head is turned that way, then they kind of both go this way. You know, if you turn it the other way, they kind of both go this way. And so that's kind of what we see going on here in these eyes. Right, as their head turned, they kind of both do this, like you saw in that other, in my eye demo. Anyway, all we got to do now is get some eyebrows on here. And they kind of sit here, I think. Her eyebrows arc upward pretty high. Kind of do this. Kind of do that. Don't know if that's her eyebrow shape exactly. I'm going to try that one more time. Guess that was good. They kind of like lock in there. I don't know. Still, honestly, I'm not super happy with that eyebrow shape. It's okay. I feel like it's not quite animated enough to be her. Let's leave it for now. Let's try the other one here. Sorry, I forgot to zoom back in. Let's try this one. It just kind of wraps up and over. I think that's working okay. It's not quite her, but I think it's getting closer, definitely. Like the proportions are working better. Let's get a hairline on there, that might help. Ear is going to sit back here. Right, top of the ear goes way up here, above that eyebrow a little bit. Bottom of the ear aligns with top part of the here. So I think the ear needs to move up, right, to really kind of help sell the fact that her head is tilted down. It's going to sit like back here. Hair is kind of wrapping back up behind there. Let's get a better ear shape on here. I think that's looking pretty good. For some reason, she looks more angry in my drawing than she does. I think it has to do with the eyebrows that I had a hard time drawing. I'll have to work on these later, maybe see if I can get them looking better. Anyway, that's basically it. I think we're probably out of time. I've been doing this for a while now.
There's some comments here that I'm seeing that are from a while ago.
Yeah.
I think this is from earlier because I was telling them that I'm not asking you questions so you can concentrate.
Yeah.
And Isaiah said, I appreciate that you don't rush your process. And then Luis said, we must protect Brian at all costs.
Nice.
With an angel emoji.
That's cool. I appreciate that.
And then, let's see, one person said hey, so hey to you if you're still here.
Hey.
And then finally, RF asked, what is the downside of drawing from photos and how can we avoid it?
The downside of drawing from photos is that, well, two things. One is photographic distortion, right, which is tough. Like if you learn from drawing from life and you go take like life drawing classes and you draw from a live model, things work a little bit differently than they do with photos. And the advantage to that is you kind of learn how things work with your eyes in reality as opposed to seeing things through the lens of a camera, you know? And so that's one of the things in my classes that I try to point out occasionally when I can. And it's not always an issue. Depending on who's taking the photo and how it's taken, it might not be a big deal. But every now and then, yeah, photographic distortion is a problem. And it usually shows up near the edges of the photo, right? So like when you're looking through a camera lens, the stuff in the center will be less distorted than the stuff out near the edges of the lens. And so like there's times where, you know, like we do a bunch of photo shoots and our office was only so big. I can only get so far back from people to zoom in because that reduces the amount of perspective and distortion. But we have some photos that have some photographic distortion and you can see every now and then there'll be someone that has their arm out and it looks like a gigantic arm that's like, you know, their hand's like twice as big as their head or something. And you're like, what is going on there? And, you know, I'll try to point that out and say like, hey, look, you know, here's how photographic distortion works. You got to be on the lookout for it. What's hard though, is if you're working only from photos and that's how you're training, it's hard to train yourself to correct that in a way that looks right, you know? And so that's partly where the classes can come in handy, not to like say that you have to take my classes, but you know, if you're taking classes and turning stuff in and I see a lot of that distortion in your drawing, that gives me a chance to point out like, oh, hey, you know what, here's what I would do in this instance. And I would shrink this hand down and shrink this arm and get it working a little bit differently as opposed to, I don't know, just continuing to struggle, I guess. But that's mostly what you need to be aware of. And the camera also changes values a little bit. So cameras work in a way where you can either, and in fact, this is almost an advantage, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, because our eye plays tricks on us, right? And so when we look at a model, like a live model, and we look in the shadows, say there's a big area that's in shadow and we look in there, our eye is really good at adjusting to let more information in and let more light in when we're looking at something dark, you know? And then when we look at the information in the light, our eye like changes again and makes sure that we get just the right amount of information and it's not like blown out. And so what's weird is that's not how drawings work, right? That's actually kind of the opposite. Like in a drawing, we want less information in the shadows and more information in the light, typically. Now, if you have a drawing where it's all in shadow and there's just like a little bit of light, you might reverse that. You might want more information in the shadows. But typically speaking, for like our typical, you know, class photos, you're going to want less information in the shadows. And what's tough is a lot of people spend a lot of time looking at the shadows and your eye will kind of adjust. And then you'll start seeing a lot of stuff in there. And you'll be like, oh, actually, there's like some light here and there's some form here. You actually want to ignore all of that for the most part and keep the shadows really simple and then put more information in the light. And that will, I don't know, make your drawing look better. At the end of the day, you got to do what's right for the drawing. And that's what's tough, is if you're learning from photos, you'll always have a tendency to kind of stick with what you have in the photos. But then, like I said, like there's also maybe disadvantages to, you know, working from reality in real life. And that's your eye kind of adjusting to things in a way that makes things a little bit more difficult. I don't know. I've seen a lot of people train both ways. I mean, I started out taking in-person classes and teaching in-person classes and with live models, and over the years have transitioned more to teaching online. And I've seen people get good at both. I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both, and I don't think if you really put in the effort, at the end of the day, I don't think either one is necessarily going to hold you back. I don't know. That's it. That's my thoughts on photo reference. And just keep in mind, like, you don't have to draw what you see in the photo necessarily. You know, it's more of a suggestion. And that's partly why photos are bad also, right? Is because there's always this tendency to copy what you see. But to be honest, that exact same tendency exists when you work from life. I mean, I did it for years. Like most people at first get really caught up in what they're seeing and trying to copy it, whether you're working from a photo or a model. So in that regard, I don't know, probably doesn't matter a whole lot either. Trying to get some sort of neck shape on here. Not sure why exactly, but that's what I started doing. Anyway, this is the end. I think we've hit the point where we probably should stop. But I made it through all of them, so that's good. Took a while, but we did it.
RF says thanks.
You're welcome, RF. Thank you for watching. One of these days, maybe we'll do like a hair live stream. I teach a hair class because hair is kind of, I don't know, like a lot of places added into the facial feature class, but it's not part of the face, first off, which kind of bothers me a little bit. And secondly, it is a feature of the head, definitely, but would I consider it a facial feature? Not really. But then we only have 5-week classes, right? So if you think about it, we would be doing like 1 week on eyes, 1 week on noses, 1 week on mouths, 1 week on ears. And then the last week would be hair, which is cool, but I like the last week being like the week where we bring it all together and you draw a whole head and figure out what to do with some of this stuff that we've been studying. And then I teach a hair class separately because hair's, I don't know, it's kind of complicated and a lot of people are confused by it. I think it warrants its own class. Full 5 weeks on hair. That's just me. I don't know. Cool. Anyway, that's the end. Thank you guys for watching. I always appreciate it. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you next week. We'll be doing this again 1 week from today.
Time to end the stream.
Yeah, you can end it. Goodbye. Oh, I dropped my eraser again. Oh, it survived. That's good. It's the worst when you drop your eraser and it falls on the ground and you pick it up and there's a bunch of little hairs and dirt stuck on it.
Oh no.
It's the worst. You basically just have to throw them away at that point.
Okay, you done?
I'm done. You can push the button.
Okay,
Okay.
bye everyone.
Bye.